please welcome Kevin Turpin, President of National Journal.
Well, thank you so much for you joining us this morning. This is our 6th annual National Journal Leadership Summit, and we're really excited about this year. Just for agenda setting items, we're scheduled to go to noon today. So very thankful for you all joining us on your morning, especially the day after such a big election last night. And I call last night kind of like the appetizer before the midterm elections next year. I wanted to go over a couple stats just to set the context that we all gather within today. So this year, or in this Congress so far, there's been 6,279 bills introduced. 73 of those bills have been signed into law. 51 executive orders have been signed by the president. And then the most important stat is there's been 2,405 tweets since Election Day a year ago. So with that context set, this is where we all gather today. This is the work that we all care about, the work that we all do. And I think the program today will hit on different points of all of the work we do as Washington professionals. So I'm very excited about the content that you all will be hearing and receiving today. And hopefully you all leave with some valuable insights from our different leaders within National Journal and then our special guest as well. So a couple logistical items. So we're going to have a panel mid-program here, and then Charlie Cook will be our headliner. There will be question and answer times set up for both of those moments. You'll see the mics on both sides of the aisles here. If you have questions, you can just get out of your seat, line up behind the mic, and then we'll be able to get to as many questions as we possibly can. The last piece is on the tweeting. We'd love for you to tweet out moments today. Our hashtag is going to be NJ Insights. So if you are going to be active on Twitter, please tag us. So with all of that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker today. Her name is Gina Kim. She's our Chief Analytics Officer. She's been with National Journal for 6 years now and just completed a great study on how government affairs professionals are going to be resourcing for 2018 and is going to share some of those insights from that study with you all this morning. So with that, I'd like to introduce Gina.
Good morning, and thank you for taking time out of your busy day to be with us. As Kevin mentioned, my name is Gina Kim. I'm Chief Analytics Officer here at National Journal, and really honored to be able to share some of our latest research findings with you. These findings, of course, come from your collective input and insight, and it's through your guidance and our ongoing study of Washington that we've uncovered several trends that I'd like to spell out for you this morning. Now, these trends may sound challenging, even as they sound all too familiar, but I believe they also point the way toward a new framework that can potentially transform how we talk about advocacy. Now, let me start just by sharing with you some of the research inputs that went into today's presentation. So over the years, we've had more than 1,000 candid, in-depth conversations with so many of you, and we are, as always, grateful for your input. In late summer and early fall of this year, we also gathered your input through our resource benchmarking survey, and this provides some quantitative rigor to the qualitative feedback that you've shared with us. And then last month, we also released our 2017 Washington in the Information Age study, which collects direct feedback not just from private sector leaders, but from professionals on Capitol Hill and in the federal agencies, giving us a 360-degree look at the trends in Washington. Okay, so just to help set the stage for explaining these trends, I want to provide some historical context. So how many of you are working in Washington in 2002, included in that, and do you remember how you kept up to date? Well, to jog your memory, we have this graphic here from our very first Washington in the Information Age study, an illustration of a chief of staff's day, along with their information intake across the day. Now you see their day starts at 0, when the alarm goes off, and then the roller coaster begins. So they're getting up to speed, reading newspapers and surfing news sites, taking phone calls in meetings, checking email alerts, monitoring television, and across the day you see their peaks and valleys in their information intake, but it's manageable. In fact, from that 2002 study, one Hill staffer told us, "I don't know that I feel overloaded. You fall into a habit of knowing where to look for the information you need and knowing what not to bother with. There's a lot out there, but I feel like I get through it." Now, I wonder how many of us would share that sentiment today, because in our 2017 Washington in the Information Age study, the picture is more chaotic and much more congested. Now, you remember in 2002 how the day started at 0. But today, as soon as we wake up, we're on our phones or our tablets. We're looking at email on our mobile devices, reading newsletters, checking social feeds. And we still have print and television, but now many other formats to take in Washington news and information, lots of choice in what, when, and how we consume. And if you think about that quote from that Hill staffer, I'm not sure that we all have a habit of knowing where to look for the information that we need and what to not bother with. The takeaway is that we are operating in a more complicated information environment. It's certainly harder for us to wade through all the available content, but it's also a challenge for us to ensure that the messages that we're sending are getting through. And it's not just the communications landscape that's more complicated. We are operating in an increasingly complex environment, and we highlighted some of these shifts a few years ago. This movement away from our traditional focus to a government affairs function of the future, with an expanded scope and new expectations for how we communicate, how we engage with others, and how we present ourselves inside and outside of Washington. What we found this year is that these emerging trends are no longer emerging. Rather, they reflect our day-to-day reality. So in our resource benchmarking survey, we asked offices to tell us the degree to which they participate in a variety of government affairs activities, and whether they're solely responsible for executing on those activities or whether they share that responsibility with others. And for those of you that feel like you're being asked to do more, from our data, it appears that you are indeed doing more. So just to pick out a couple data points for reference, when we last did this study in 2013, just 57% of organizations were engaged in coalition management. 57% compared to roughly 90% of you all today. And some of the items that are now on your plate weren't really on everybody's radar back in 2013. Activities like stakeholder mapping or developing thought leadership content. But now, 85% of you engage in those activities. And what's more is that a number of these items are not the sole responsibility of government affairs, but we're partnering more often with peers in other departments. So we're operating in a more complex environment. Our scope of responsibility has widened, and we're being asked to do more. So how do we apply our resources, our headcount, and our budget to execute on these new, more complex activities? Well, when it comes to resourcing, whether your office is pulling back, staying the course, or growing, there are a variety of challenges that members have articulated in their conversations with us. So on the left-hand side, you see some quotes from folks that are unsure about how they'll manage going forward with shrinking resources. And then there in the center, when budgets are flat, a need to constantly recalibrate your allocations or consider how you're going to fund new activities. And then on the right-hand side, even those that have staffed up or have plans to, a desire to ensure that their resources are being put to their highest and best use. So, with more to do in this uncertain environment, how are offices thinking about resourcing for next year? Here at the top, we show plans for budget changes in 2018, with associations on the left, corporate government affairs on the right. And you'll see that spending increases are more likely for associations than corporations. So about half of associations plan to increase their budgets, compared to about a third of corporate offices. But at the bottom, we have staffing projections, the majority of organizations holding headcount levels steady. So our sense is that when it comes to resourcing, staffing in particular, organizations are approaching 2018 with caution, perhaps reflecting uncertain economic and policy conditions. But beyond prepping for 2018, we also recognize that we need to take a longer-term view when it comes to resource planning, especially when the job is increasingly complex and in flux. And so to gain insight into what's on the horizon, we ask government affairs offices to tell us where they plan to invest, either time or people or dollars, across a variety of areas over the next 3 years. We ask them to rate roughly 15 to 20 investment areas in all. And here we have the top 5 investments for associations on the left, corporate government affairs on the right, and you'll see there are 2 key areas of overlap. Usage of social media and digital communications tools, a priority for both, and building or managing the organization's reputation in Washington, also a top priority. Now, if you remember back to that day in the life graphic that we just looked at from 2017, remember it was such a cluttered information environment. These shared priority investments suggest to us that some are addressing that clutter by adopting new tools to communicate and build networks and build brand here in Washington. Now, beyond the shared priorities, associations' investments tend to focus on core activities, grassroots or grass tops advocacy, or federal affairs, either at the executive branch or legislative branch. Meanwhile, corporations' anticipated investments include building out coalitions and partnerships, again, a strategy to help ensure your message breaks through in a crowded communications environment, and they're otherwise focused on internal activities, opportunities to more deeply engage senior leaders, or clarify the value of the government affairs function. Now, this issue of measuring government affairs impact is a critical one, and one that's been coming up with increasing regularity in our conversations with so many of you. But before we dig in there, let me just share another observation about investment priorities. Okay, so here we have the full list of investment priorities for associations. And in this chart, the purple reflects areas of anticipated investment growth, the gray signals no change, and the red reflects decreases. Now, it's too much to read each line off the screen, but what I really want to draw your attention to is the pattern in responses. You see, there's lots of areas for increased investment, again in purple, or even areas to hold steady there in the gray, but there isn't much red. So nowhere are we offsetting those increased investments with decreases elsewhere. Now here we have the chart for corporations, but now the blue reflects increased investment. And again, it's too much to read off each line, but I think you get the point. It's still, we still see a variety of areas for increased investment in blue, few areas in red. So no trade-offs by decreasing investments elsewhere. So this brings us to this question. If you're trying to maintain or justify new investments, how are we demonstrating that these resources will be put to good use? Well, government affairs offices across the spectrum continue to tell us what a challenge it is for them to determine and employ performance metrics of any kind. You see the quotes here on this page. Hard for us to prove any impact one way or another, or it's always difficult to quantify the value of government affairs. Now, our members tell us that this challenge has grown even more acute during the current climate in Washington, where it feels like there are fewer policy outcomes against which one can be measured. So how are organizations dealing with this challenge? Well, when we talked with policy executives about developing performance metrics, many brought up one particular concern, namely that in the traditional view of metrics, government affairs is often entirely measured on outcomes, which are often outside of their control. And we illustrate this here. So on the left-hand side of the spectrum, you see a snapshot of a view of past performance. Some years are great, some years aren't. And our hope is that we have enough wins to keep the ledger positive over the years, and that not too much time passes in between those periodic windfall victories. And then on the right-hand side of the spectrum, the future remains unknown. It's hard to predict, difficult to have confidence in what will happen next. Performance hinges largely on things outside of our control, and past successes have little bearing on predicting the future. But we know that the political system is designed to move slowly in fits and starts. And so just measuring outcomes that we don't control can be a source of vulnerability. In other words, if your job is changing, if your scope of responsibilities is expanding while the landscape is shifting and more uncertain than ever, then it stands to reason that your performance metrics may need to evolve. And this gets back to my original point, that while the trends are concerning, they point the way to a new framework, and new performance measurements are key. Because if we are only focused on outcomes, we can't always tell if we are on track to reach our goals. Now, there are a few organizations that measure to see if they're strong and have the capacity to influence when windows emerge. And this view emphasizes preparedness. So these organizations have desired policy outcomes, and they back out of that victory the ingredients that are needed and evaluate if they are in a good position relative to them. In this illustration on the right-hand side, you see the goal is a specific legislative outcome, and working backwards, there are a handful of components that are identified as driving that goal. Strong Hill relationships, active coalition partners, recognition of your subject matter expertise, having an engaged grassroots community. And there at the bottom of the page, you see there are metrics that reflect progress on each of those pieces. Now, collectively, these metrics ask the question, not simply are we going to win, a binary outcome, or have we won, a retrospective look. Rather, the questions and metrics are focused on the issue of whether the team is set up to succeed in the future. It's about strategic capacity or preparedness. Can we take advantage of an opening window? So how do we move from a conventional view of metrics to a more progressive one? Well, organizations should measure those things that give them insight into future performance or leading indicators. Outcomes alone are a dangerous way to count, especially when legislative or regulatory movement is slow. Here we have data from our benchmarking survey where we asked government affairs offices to indicate what types of measures they use to evaluate their performance. And what we found is that organizations are adapting to take into consideration the slowdown in legislative or regulatory activity, looking to different metrics to capture and demonstrate their worth. So at the top, you see traditional metrics like policy outcomes, highly popular among DC offices, stakeholder measures, more popular among associations, and then financial measures, more widely used among corporations. But beyond those traditional metrics, towards sort of halfway towards the bottom of the page, you see capacity measures. Now, these are metrics that illustrate our ability to make progress on our advocacy priorities when needed. Items such as expanded policymaker or influencer relationships, or improved organizational visibility or reputation. In addition, at the bottom, you see offices measuring interim progress through what we call perceptual measures. These are metrics that capture our ability to shift mindsets, whether it's increasing awareness of our issues or driving more favorable attitudes towards the issues that we advocate and communicate around. Another way to look at this is organizations are moving away from relying solely on backwards-looking measures, how we performed in the past, to more forward-looking measures. How are we set up for success in the future? Now, how do we go about doing this? Well, first, when we're producing metrics for the government affairs function, a key consideration is gaining consensus on your advocacy goals. And once there's agreement on the objectives, we can create metrics that map to those priorities. Now, you may have already done this within your organizations, but if not, we have this questionnaire and we can administer this for you. And it can be completed by the head of office, but in many instances, it may be better for the full team to participate to ensure that there's alignment across the group. Now, this questionnaire covers a variety of elements from one's advocacy work, including lobbying relationships, grassroots engagement, third-party networks, but it's after identifying the top priorities that we can have a meaningful conversation on the metrics that should be tracked. Okay, now, despite a desire to talk about strategic capabilities, we will still expect to and want to talk about outcomes. So we suggest setting up two conversation streams going on in parallel. And most organizations conflate these conversations, but one is about outcomes and the other about strategic capabilities. So in that first conversation, we'll cover that long list of active and inactive issues that the office is engaged on with an assessment of what's moving, what's happening right now. That second conversation is about strategic capability, revealing the health of your function. And this helps identify whether you are pacing towards your policy goals. But it also helps turn outsiders, those that are unfamiliar with how Washington works, into insiders. Because rather than judge government affairs solely by its achievement of policy outcomes, these individuals can gain a more nuanced view of your work when you reveal to them how you think about the strength of your government affairs office. It's about using this new performance management framework to transform how we think and talk about advocacy. Okay, so I've given you an overview of the trends that we're seeing for 2018 and beyond. We started with a look at the not-so-distant past to give you some context for where we've been and where we think we're going. And hopefully, you've given you some insight on how to better confront tomorrow's challenges. And in large part, it starts with a change in perspective. So by looking out over the windshield instead of into the rearview mirror, we'll be better equipped to deal with whatever new challenges come our way. And of course, I would be remiss in my duties if I didn't tell you that National Journal has several resources to help you on your performance management journey. You've listed them here. I want to thank you for your time and your ongoing support, and we look forward to continuing to serve you and offer you research and guidance where we can. Thank you.
Please welcome Michael Gottlieb, President of Ballast Research.
No, that's all right. Don't worry about it. Thank you very much. Thank you for taking the time this morning to be with us. I know how very valuable your time is, and I'm honored to spend it with you. My name is Mike Gottlieb. I'm the president of Ballast Research. We're a division of National Journal. I'll start with an apology. Forgive my voice this morning. I'm a little under the weather. This presentation should probably be sponsored by Dayquil and NyQuil. I'll tell you, they don't usually advertise using them together, but if you need a little vacation, it's worth trying. So Gina shared with you a couple of insights, the theme of which is how we look into the front view through the windshield and not the rear view mirror. Some of the insights that Gina's research has surfaced focuses on performance metrics and what the right performance metrics for your work is, and the need to evolve some of those metrics in light of the current environment. The idea being that tracking bills or number of meetings or level of seniority attending those meetings is not necessarily the right metric to really understand how prepared you are to succeed in the future. Ballast Research focuses on that mission. What are the appropriate metrics to measure effectiveness in Washington, and how to increase effectiveness in Washington in this changing environment with specific detail? But the second mission, and probably the more important mission, is to help improve the conversation in Washington. Gina's research and that of National Journal traditionally focuses on best practice research culled from your insights. We are scoping the territory of the work of government affairs and communications professionals in Washington and trying to surface the best of those practices and tools to evangelize across the entire group. Ballast Research focuses on a different aspect of sources. We are engaged with policymakers. We are engaged with in-seat government professionals, and we are trying to understand from them what is effective. Gina made reference to reputation and brand management. That's the core of our work. We are trying to find out from the chiefs of staff and the LDs and the LDAs and the folks at the White House and at the agencies what their life is like and what, from your perspective, is most helpful to them. This requires an investigation as to what effectiveness means. And this is entirely a shift from our old thinking. We can no longer judge effectiveness simply based on perceptions. That would be a rather easy task. We could put you all out in front of the museum and poll you on who you think is effective in Washington. It will give you a measure. And if we ask you to list the top 5 most effective organizations in Washington, there will probably be some overlap. But when we track that to what Gina was talking about, are those organizations actually moving the ball? Are they actually in part and driving the conversation in Washington? In a frustrating environment where bills are not passing at the rate that we had expected, it usually doesn't track. And so the question is, what is really effective? What is really effective has much more to do with brand and reputation and influence than the external outcomes that Gina was describing. So how do we get at that? Well, one way is we ask policymakers. And we ask them the kinds of questions that are more tied to what we see as effectiveness than the traditional external measures that really don't account for or justify your investment in Washington and the hard work that you're doing. So let me give you a sense of the kinds of questions that we ask. First and foremost, to what extent do you respect a particular organization's role in Washington? Not are they influential, but do you have a sense of why they should be engaged in the policy conversation? This is so key to the ability to then influence and drive conversation that it's a threshold for operation in Washington. The second question we ask is, to what extent do you consider the views of those organizations? You may respect them, you may see them as valuable in Washington, but are you inviting them in the room? That's another level of threshold to influence in Washington. And then thirdly, we'll ask policymakers, to what extent do they influence your work? What extent do what they provide in the meeting actually drive decision-making and your policy-making decisions? And then finally, and here's kind of a gold standard question that we ask, to what extent do you seek them out? Are you asking them for their perspectives, or is it always incoming? Are you as a chief of staff or LD or LA calling up that organization? And why? And why not another organization? Those are the kinds of questions that form the basis of our research of understanding what is effective in Washington. I should also pause. If there's anything that I say, we've got some time, and I'll save a little bit of time for question and answer at the end, but if there's anything I say that doesn't make sense or you want to ask about, it's a small enough room, please just raise your hand or shout out. We can pause. So who are we talking to? We're talking to folks, as I said, on Capitol Hill, in the executive branch, in the private sector, think tanks and nonprofit leadership. And we're taking a set of 100 organizations. These are 100 organizations heavily invested in Washington. They are corporations and they are associations. And we are asking policymakers for each of these organizations, what are they giving you? What's helpful to you across a series of measures that I'll describe a little bit later? Why do these folks engage with us? Why do policymakers who are as stressed and as short on time as you are talk to us about the incoming that they're receiving? Because they buy in the mission. They understand that there has for years been an inadequacy in the information exchange between your audience and you. So many of you come from government, from the public sector. I served under the Bush administration, the Obama administration, most recently in the White House, and I can certainly attest to this. We did not have a good mechanism as individual policymakers for giving candid, direct, consistent feedback to the advocates that were investing in the work and the policymaking that we did. The number of times I was in a meeting, and my policy portfolio covered a whole bunch of things: transportation, defense, immigration, veterans affairs, civil rights, criminal justice, and NASA. We were getting advocated on for a lot of issues. The number of times I wanted to just kind of freeze frame the meeting and say, stop. I know what you're trying to get at. I know the decision you're trying to influence. This is not helpful. You have no concept of the meeting I'm about to have and the advocacy that I actually need from you, the research I need, the data I need. There are few instances where you can have that kind of candid interchange, but certainly not enough across the amount of policy that gets done in Washington. We're trying to solve for that problem. We are trying to do, for lack of a better analogy, consumer market intel and consumer market analysis on your consumer market. The reason this hasn't been done before is because this is a very idiosyncratic consumer market. They are hard to reach, they are hard to engage. We engage them again because they understand that we will take the information they're giving us, give it back to you, and hopefully improve the efficiency of the process. If you better understand what you should be measuring, what is actually effective, in other words, what's useful to them, you will invest more in those tactics and less in those external factors upon which you're judged and upon which your stakeholders have traditionally judged the investment in government affairs and communications. What does this produce? A bunch of data. We are metrics-based, we are measurement-based. This is central to the work of your business unit colleagues in any corporation or association membership. We are trying to add some of the data that Gina referred to to your investment, to guide your strategic investment, but also to validate the work that you do. Because if we're just judging your success by whether the bill passed or didn't, that's such a limiting factor. Tax reform may pass in some measure. A lot of people are going to take credit for it. How many individual organizations actually influenced it? Or if it doesn't pass, a lot of people will be held accountable. But how much does that track with what you actually did? The question here is, as Gina said, how close are you to the decision-making process? How well situated are you for the future of advocacy? What I've shown you here is a graphic illustrating a small segment of our research. We have about 10 industries on this graphic, but we study many more: tobacco, transportation, progressive associations, issue advocacy groups. This is actually just corporations, but we study major associations in Washington. And for each one, which is represented by a green dot on the graphic, we ask policymakers a whole bunch of questions, both quantitatively and qualitatively in conversation, to understand in each of these industries who's effective and why. What are you getting from them? How well positioned are they to influence you on future bills, regulations, executive orders? And you see a lot just from this graphic. The first thing you see, which hopefully is obvious, is not all industries are the same. Our colleagues in banking are still frustrated by a set of external factors that are different than those enjoyed by our colleagues in technology. Asterisk. The technology data is changing. If I had shown you this graphic last year, the green dots would all be clustered at the top of that scale. In other words, all of the technology companies that we studied last year were performing far more effectively in Washington, based on our metrics, than any other industry. We are now seeing a disaggregation based on a number of factors, not least of which is the recent congressional inquiries. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But by and large, you see some accounting for the external environment in which each industry is operating. So you're not going to expect a bank, no matter how extraordinary the government affairs shop is, to perform as well as a defense organization. Why? It's a different set of factors. It's a different set of issues upon which you're advocating. But within that scope of banks, you've got one that is performing well above the crowd. Our obsession is what is driving that effective performance. And equally important, why is that bank at the bottom of the graphic not performing as well? Now, I should say, these are 50 or so corporations that perform extremely well. The bar here is very high even for admission into the study. This is Top Gun. We're looking for the best of the best. What are the factors that take an extremely well-resourced government affairs and communications operation and make it actually among the most impactful in Washington? Back to that question about which corporations or associations do you proactively seek out and share information from? That's the question, because policymakers have such limited amounts of time, they can only call one or two, perhaps, outside advocates, if you're lucky. How do you get to be that level of participation? The other thing that is apparent here is the scope and spread, excuse me, upon which these different corporations are advocating. Why is it that in the defense industry, most of those companies are clustered together at the very high end? And why is it, putting tech aside, why is it that the telecom industry has a larger spread? What are the kinds of things that inure to the strength of those operations? Well, I'll tell you one thing. For the most part, it is not investment. It is not money. There is a certain threshold of investment that is table stakes for effective operation in Washington. However, and this is one of the early insights of our data and our research, to which I credit Kevin and Gina, who began with this product. We were published in Harvard Business Review with the finding that if you take investment in Washington and effectiveness in Washington, by and large, if you put a scatter plot up, there is no correlation. Except for one measure, lobbying. On lobbying advocacy and the effectiveness of lobbying, you got to pay for it. That's the good news for some of you in the room. It is also the least distinguishing factor for corporations to use because you all do it very well. Associations and corporations have effective lobbyists in Washington. It is, again, table stakes. So where are the areas where you can improve and distinguish yourself from the rest of the crowd? I'm going to make game time decision. You can tell how much I'm into sports. It took me a while to get that phrase. If you look here, we've actually distinguished the areas of investment that most distinguish a corporation and association advocating in Washington. These are the elements of investment that policymakers find most useful and most influential to them. Now, let me do some table setting here. All of these are important. They are the basis, they are the result of research that we did over the course of 2 years, asking those policymakers I described, what's important to you? What matters to you? And by implication, what doesn't? We started with 200 line items that we got from you all. We asked you, hey, what are you spending money on? Let's go test the audience you're trying to reach and figure out what they're interested in. This is what they came up with. So all of them are important, which is to say, we don't find a single organization in Washington that is effective without being excellent on each of these. But where's the lowest hanging fruit? And this was another insight that was somewhat surprising in the research. The lowest hanging fruit and the easiest way to distinguish your brand and your reputation from others in the space is through corporate citizenship. Corporate conduct and corporate social responsibility. Now, this was an insight that was somewhat surprising to us until we looked into the qualitative research and better understood why policymakers care about corporate social responsibility. And this is a key insight, and it leads us to understand why so few offices in Washington are leveraging this metric appropriately. Policymakers care about corporate social responsibility and corporate conduct in ways that are different than consumers. And for the most part, advocates in Washington use the same materials that are produced by your CSR and marketing teams that are aimed at targeting consumers for policymakers. It's a huge lost opportunity. And this actually allows me the opportunity to distinguish your policy reputation and your policy brand from any other brand that attaches to your organization. If you're an association, you may have a membership brand. If you're in the science sector, you may have a research brand or a science brand and reputation. If you're a corporation, you have a corporate brand, you have a consumer brand, you have a Wall Street brand. You may have any number of different reputations based on the audience you're trying to reach. Your policy brand is separate. It has some overlap with your corporate or consumer brand, but not as much as you'd think. We have highly effective organizations in Washington and corporations that suffer in a consumer brand, and it is not strengthening their policy brand. Policymakers care about things in different ways than consumers, and the overlap is actually relatively small. So what do policymakers care about when it comes to corporate social responsibility? They care about your credibility on the policy issues that are of interest to you and where you're vulnerable. In other words, if you are in the food and beverage industry, rather than giving your corporate social responsibility investment to childhood education, you're going to invest in childhood health and well-being. Or perhaps sustainability. If you're a soda company, water sustainability would be an issue on which you are invested from a policy perspective. So when you go into that meeting, you can use the corporate social responsibility as a means by which to talk about your policy issues. This is key to the research, and I'll just say the other elements here: research and data, the context with which you provide these arguments, your reputation for working towards reasonable compromise. Each of these are the elements of the research that we engage policymakers on to get an understanding of how they view 100 different associations and corporations. And these become, for many of our clients, the basis of their strategic planning. When they are asked by their stakeholders, what should we invest in? This is where we advise you begin. When they ask, how should we measure you? It's not the bills. It's not the number of meetings. It's not the seniority of who's at the meeting or how many folks you got to meet with the CEO. That may be of idiosyncratic interest to your stakeholders, to your CEO. It may be of interest to your consumers. There may be any number of reasons to continue investing in those things, but not to track the effectiveness of your Washington operation. These are the metrics that count because these are the metrics that policymakers tell us actually influence them. And we have a whole body of research which I'm happy to share to any of you about best practices in this area. Let me pause there for a moment. Let's just ask if there are any questions about what I've said so far. Again, we're all friends here. It's a small room. Yes, sir.
Great data, Michael. Great presentation. Any discrimination between Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies on this corporate conduct metric and smaller, more medium-sized, more numerous clients that we have?
So,
That have the leverage to go out and promote their CSR.
So the question is, if I may, any difference between the Fortune 100, the Fortune 500, and the smaller organizations that maybe don't have the leverage or the investment to promote their CSR, in terms of the effectiveness of that work? Based on our research, no. And here's where it ties back to the lack of correlation between investment past a certain threshold. And we can, National Journal does some benchmarking work. We can give you a sense of what that threshold is. But what distinguishes the effective folks from those who are not effective is really simple. Have they simply asked the question, what does that audience care about this investment? Whether it's $5,000 or $5 million. And let me tell you, we have clients and we see organizations in the research who are investing millions and millions of dollars on corporate social responsibility, on research, on any number of things that are run out of marketing and focused on consumers and the consumer brand and what consumers care about. It's a huge lost opportunity. If I could just leave you with one message, it is that the collaboration and coordination between government affairs and DC comms and those who are controlling the enormous investments you're making for another purpose should increase, so that the head of GA can say, hey, I'm not going to tell you what to invest in, although I'd love the opportunity, but could we turn that 40-page document on our CSR investments that we send around to everybody and nobody reads on the Hill into a one-pager that has the 3 bullets that I actually need to use to advance the conversation I'm having next week on a policy issue that actually is related? That's key. Let me leave you with one other slide, and that is this. This has been a challenging year. Again, we're all friends here. Raise of hands if you're exhausted. Okay, good. It's been a challenging year. I think among our clients, they have seen more incoming from their stakeholders than in the last several years. Let me tell you 2 things. First of all, the policymakers with whom we engage, they're exhausted too. Because we work a lot with them and we try to support their work. That's another reason they engage in our research. They are putting so many people on the phones to deal with the incoming they're getting. They don't have enough time to do the policy work. They're having interns leave because of the incoming hostility from their constituents. They are slammed. They are stretched. The one thing I want to leave you with is don't pull back. Over the course of the last years, we study reputation across a number of the organizations within our membership and outside of our membership. We see overall a majority of companies whose reputation has declined over the last year. That is in part because a number of organizations spent the first 8 months of the year trying to figure out what the heck is going on. And it wasn't a vacation. There was a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, but it wasn't investment in what was actually happening in Washington. We see 2 quotes, and I'll leave you with these. You don't see a whole lot of lobbying up here. There's less engagement than there was previously by a long shot. I don't know if it's just the Democratic offices or just with me, but there seems to have been less outreach in the last 8 months. Gina told you the investment is increasing, but the engagement in the first half to 8 months of the year was not consistent with prior engagement because folks were trying to figure out how to engage and where to go. That creates a vulnerability. It creates a risk. It creates a vacuum in which others can fill out your reputation. So overall, these are the metrics. I'm happy to be available to any of you to elaborate on this information, or if you'd like access to the research, I'm supposed to leave you with my email address so that we can actually follow up. There it is. Thank you very much for taking the time, and have a good day.
Please welcome moderator Dave Edwards, co-editor of Quartz Owl, Kim Bayless, principal at Perry Bayless, Edward Felton, founding director of Princeton's Center for Information Technology Policy, and Scott Frederick, partner and head of business development and federal at New Enterprise Associates.
Thanks a lot. We're very excited to be here. We have a great panel of people to talk with you about artificial intelligence and regulation, a topic that has been growing in interest and definitely got very interesting over just the past few weeks. Again, my name is Dave Edwards. I'm with Quartz, a sister publication of the National Journal. I'm very happy to be here. Just to set the stage a little bit, one of the questions that always comes up with AI is the challenge of talking about it is everybody has a different definition. And so just to sort of level set, when we talk about artificial intelligence or AI, or some people say AI and ML, machine learning, the basic overview to think of is that's a combination of an algorithm and data. So the only way that AI works is that there is some form of mathematical calculation that analyzes data to accomplish some form of task. And it can be just as simple as that. The origins of AI go back to the 1950s-ish. A lot of what we see today that is so impressive is based on math that was known then. A lot of the algorithms that are used to classify things, to understand images, to recommend products to you, have been around for decades. AI became sort of an explosive field within the last 5-8 years, mostly through the big changes in the quantity of data that has been captured and is made accessible by big tech companies, and the quantity of big computing. A lot of AI tasks take quite a lot of computational power. So all of those things have come together in a way that has made this field explosive. It has gone from a place where students would go into a PhD program with the plan to be an academic and to do research for the rest of their careers. And now, within the span of a few years, they're coming out and they're getting the biggest job offers that there are in Silicon Valley, and they're all a bit confused at why they suddenly became so popular. But it's very exciting. In terms of the concepts of regulation, just to put another sort of level set, I think about it as there's sort of three big topics that people like to talk about. One is security and warfare, because of course everybody thinks of artificial intelligence, they think of the Terminator. But there's a big spectrum of AI having agency and ability to move and therefore potentially be scary. It could be quite scary as warfare, but it could be as benign and helpful as a self-driving car. And so there's this big wide range. The second topic that usually comes up is, or maybe more frequently comes up, is jobs. And the question, the risk of jobs and automation. I assume for this audience it's a big topic. Right? What's happening with automation when any company decides to make a big press release about AI? Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? That's always a difficult conversation to have. So that also, though, has a spectrum. Some of it's very helpful. It can help people be more efficient, but in other ways it's threatening. I saw this morning that the Deutsche Bank CEO very helpfully said that half of his employees might lose their job. I'm not sure how well quoted that was, but I'm glad I don't work at Deutsche Bank. The third, which is definitely an area that we'll talk today about, is the question of influence and manipulation. And we live this every day. Every Google search, every product you look for on an e-commerce website, every time you open a social media feed, AI is presenting the information to you. That's most people think of as helpful. The question then becomes obviously the scary question of manipulation, whether it's manipulating an individual to buy something or an individual to vote for a particular person or some sort of cyber warfare crime. I just wanted to sort of give you that as sort of a breakdown. So we have a wonderful panel here. I'm going to skip the normal intros because you have very helpful bios there that will tell you all about the wonderful backgrounds we have. But I'm going to start off by asking Kim and Ed and Scott a handful of questions. This is designed to be interactive. This is designed to be helpful to you, the audience. We'll have about a little bit less than 40 minutes now of us having a conversation, and I'm going to ask you to come to the mics and ask questions, so keep those in mind, and we'll try and get through as much as we can. I'm going to start with Ed, as you'll see in your bio, a professor at Princeton, who also was chief technologist at the FTC for a period of time and was also in the office of the CIO and the White House towards the end of the Obama administration. And one of the things you'll notice, if you want to understand government and AI, please go back and try and find, I don't know where they are, the white papers. Ed led an effort to write 2 really seminal white papers about AI and government. I don't think the White House still has them on the website.
I don't know, but if you want to find them, the first one is called Preparing for the Future of Artificial Intelligence. It has a nice White House logo on the front. And the second one is called Artificial Intelligence, Automation, and the Economy.
Great.
So you should be able to find them with the help of your AI-enabled search engine.
Someone has stored them somewhere. But Ed, if you could rewind for us a little bit and help and go back and tell us about the intent of that project. How did that project come to be that you actually thought that this was a topic you wanted to spend that time on? And give us some of the high-level conclusions about what came out of that, especially as you think about the possibilities of regulating what you thought might be good areas for government to focus on.
Sure. So the desire to do these reports emerged basically because of all of the talk that was going on in public, talk in the industry about the importance of AI, about AI being a really transformative technology that might be up there with the internet and mobile computing and the cloud as a really important trend in how technology developed. And then a little bit as well out of the sort of Terminator or existential risk talk. That is not the main event. That's not the main thing I think we should be worrying about. But nonetheless, when famous smart people like Elon Musk say this might be an existential risk to humanity, we pay attention. So what we did is what's often done, which is broad consultation. We held a set of 5 public workshops across the country, took an awful lot of meetings, did consultation within the government, and put together the first consensus report, the Preparing for the Future of AI report, which talked about the importance of AI and then sort of broke down area by area what were the policy issues and the challenges for government that might emerge from that. And I'll come back to talk about the regulatory issues there in a minute. We then decided, because of the importance in particular of the issue of automation and its impact on the job market, to break that out into a separate report, which came out in December of last year, that looked in particular at what we know and don't know about the impact of AI on the job market. Those impacts will be profound, I think, and raise some really important policy challenges. So going back to the first report and talking about regulation, there are really a few ways to have that conversation. One is to ask, should there be some kind of regulation of AI in general as AI? I don't see the case for that, and I don't think that's likely to happen. It's hard to draw the line between AI and other technologies, for one thing, and for another, we don't really know how we would regulate it. What I think is much more likely is that you'll see existing regulatory regimes in sectors where there already is regulation get applied and updated in light of what AI is doing. So as a good example there, you can look at regulation of vehicles. There already is regulation of vehicles and of drivers for safety and so on. And the question is how to apply and adapt that as we move towards self-driving vehicles, which are very near to being on the market in a widespread way. And so it's more a question of adaptation, I think, when it comes to regulation, as opposed to entirely new approaches to or regulatory regimes.
How do you think about the sort of the post-game? After obviously administration's changed, the focus that you guys had was running right up until the end.
Yes.
I mean, as an observer from the outside, it felt like we were really becoming a world leader in understanding what, you know, as a government understanding this technology. What do you think the risk is, since that discussion has not really kept going in the White House now?
It has not. I think you had the normal hiccup that happens due to any transition, where a lot of people go out the door and then it takes a while to restaff. And we haven't seen the level of activity picking back up as of yet, I think, in this area from the sort of general government policymaking standpoint. That said, in particular areas such as cars and drones, where you have an existing regulatory regime, I think there still is forward momentum, especially on vehicles. The new administration put out a revised version of the main Obama administration regulatory document, which I view as continuing the same direction toward trying to bring this very beneficial technology into operation. So I think in some of the specific regulatory areas, we have seen some continued progress. But sort of the big picture, there's not nearly as much evident as I think we had going before.
Okay. I'm going to turn to Kim Bayless, a partner at Perry Bayless, who has been involved with technology and especially Capitol Hill for many, many years here. One of the questions, a key topic of just the last few weeks has obviously been big tech companies coming and testifying before Congress. I'm sure at least a lot of us were very glued to the testimony to understand that. And although it was not described directly as regulating artificial intelligence, the question of regulating data and the privacy of that data has an effect on what those companies can do with their algorithms. And I'd like to get your perspective on what's happening on the Hill in terms of regulating these large tech companies, the reaction to international influence in the elections, and your perspective on how well the legislators understand these topics.
Sure. So I think the way to look at it is that these hearings last week with all of the general counsels, the legal people from the big social media platform companies were sort of the end of a arc that started this year anyway with the big Equifax breach, data breach. 146 million consumers' data has been released, and Congress has had a longstanding interest in privacy, protecting consumer data, but has been unable at this point to move legislation that really restricts collection of the data, and has been focused on what happens after it's released. How are we going to help consumers sort of pick up the pieces? I think because of all the Russian interference in the election and the use of data to target specific kinds of messages to people, I think the light bulbs are going off over the heads of the policymakers, and they're saying, wow, this is a much bigger issue than we thought it was. And as Congress does, everything is reactive. They don't really think about things proactively and try to put in place regulations. It's usually all reacting to something. And so I think the challenge for the tech companies or for anybody that collects consumer data is that you have a big knowledge gap, because as it became clear in the hearings last week, senators, there's kind of a generational situation where senators they're not using Facebook, or if they know about Facebook because their staff has a presence for them on Facebook. They don't really use these technologies, so they're not really sure how it works. So they're coming to this all new and fresh. And then I think on top of that, it's really hard for Congress to deal with technology issues because they don't have an independent way of assessing these issues. They're really dependent on the companies themselves or on outside watchdog groups to tell them what's happening. Since 1994, when they did away with the Office of Technology Assessment, Congress really has no independent way, no means to do studies, to do research, and so it falls to the White House or it falls to other agencies to undertake that kind of work. And I think that makes it really challenging. And so I think companies are really vulnerable in this current atmosphere.
How well do you think that tech companies are doing at filling that gap and educating legislators today?
Not well at all. I'll be honest, the tech companies have tried to evade any kind of involvement with Congress. The ones that sort of recognize they need to be here, they're big enough, they're household names, they have brands to protect. They can also be used in political ways, so maybe it makes sense to try to build some relationships with elected officials. Have never been very willing to be forthcoming about how exactly how they make money and how their businesses operate, what's their business plan, and how they use data. And I think until members of Congress realize how much data is being collected and how insecure it might be and how at risk consumers might be, they didn't really put two and two together. So now companies are faced with trying to educate to the extent they're willing to educate. They're relying a lot on trade associations or other industry groups, and there's a real risk in that because those groups, are sort of using euphemistic kind of terms and aren't specific to a particular company. So it's a challenging situation.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting to see how well the tech companies actually collaborate together on the question. I don't know if you want to reflect on that.
Well, I think, so you still have some tech companies who are in denial and don't really think they have a huge problem with Congress. They think their problems, or they don't think they have a problem with their business practices. They think all of this is because they have competitors who are running campaigns against them, whispering campaigns, or sometimes even shouting campaigns, and trying to, throw them under the bus, slash their tires, and find. They're very adept at using the public policy process to undermine their competitors. And you see a lot of that happening, and I think it's grown over the past 5 or 6 years. And it's just amazing to me. In no other industry that I've been involved with advising clients do you have this kind of bloodthirsty competition where they'll just stop at nothing in the public policy sphere than you have in the Silicon Valley companies. And I think the risk is they bring them all down, and so it backfires on them. But so companies are sort of avoiding the real hard questions because they think, all of this is just being generated by somebody who's in litigation with me, and they're whispering to Congress and they're telling him to look at this particular issue.
Yeah, I think the age question that you brought up about Senate is fascinating. We actually did a calculation. I think the numbers were that the average age of the current Senate is 61 years old. The average age of a Facebook employee is 28. Right. So it's such a striking delta. That's more than a parent-child delta.
It's a grandparent child.
Exactly. So it's the fact that these two groups have difficulty communicating is not necessarily surprising. Scott, I wanted to turn to you. So Scott is a partner at NEA, New Enterprise Associates, one of the largest venture capital firms, one of the oldest venture firms, and very heavily invested in a variety of companies across big data and artificial intelligence. And he is based here in DC, so has quite a lot of knowledge of how these companies can interact, or maybe opinions about how they should interact with government. One of the pushbacks on regulating any technology, but especially in this area, is that there's a risk that it will stifle innovation.
Yep.
And I'd be curious to get your perspective on this particular area and whether you are watching what's happening in DC or anticipating things, and if that makes you concerned about the possibilities for the companies that you are investing in.
Excuse me. Yeah, great question. I think a lot of people assume that VCs or investors are going to be anti-regulation. And I guess at the highest level, what I'd say, I really don't think that's the case. What I'd say is we're anti-regulatory uncertainty. It's the uncertainty in the system that creates friction and makes it very difficult to build companies. As long as we know what the rules are, I'd argue our companies can innovate around them. Actually, that has a negative connotation. I don't mean it to come across that way. So from our perspective, it's not that there shouldn't be regulation. It's that uncertainty really imposes a lot of costs in the system. I do think that AI and machine learning pose some particularly intractable or potentially intractable problems. I hear it less so in the US than in Europe, but a lot of people are talking about we need to know how the algorithms are coming to their decisions. And I raise that because at a fundamental level, I think that question shows that the people asking it don't understand the way deep convolutional neural nets work. A deep convolutional neural net works a lot like our own minds. We're not sure how we got to the decision we got to. We got there, though. So in most of these algorithms, and you'd be able to speak to it much better than I, it's very difficult to unwind and explain how you got to a decision. So I think that's going to be a very difficult question to navigate, policy question. I think in areas like anti-fraud or cybersecurity, it's probably fine to have the algorithms just do their thing and come to the best possible answer. When you start getting to regulated industries, whether or not it's the extension of credit for a financial services company or the provision of health care, that raises an entirely different set of issues. Obviously, things like gender and ethnicity, you don't want them to be determinative in the extension of a line of credit. The problem is then if you're not sure how the algorithm is getting to its answer, you could say, all right, well, just don't let those inputs go into the algorithm. But then I'd argue that any data is biased. And so you can pick up the same signal from other elements of data. And so I think those are going to be some really difficult questions. Another one that was brought up is on the privacy front. And again, Europe, I think, has been a little out in front. And actually here I now mean that in a negative sense, where I'm not sure they're fully cognizant of the implications. But the right to be forgotten is, I think, some fundamentally well-intentioned legislation that just doesn't work in the real world, especially now in a cloud environment, multi-cloud. The whole idea of where data resides is really hard to answer. So to just have one individual say, all right, I want my digital life forgotten, I'm not even sure I know what that means. And so if you're Facebook, if you're companies that have all these digital tracks and signals of you, it's just not practical to erase those footprints.
Ed, did you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah, I think this issue about the complexity of AI systems and how you can think about issues of fairness and accountability and governance. How do you prevent discriminatory or sometimes just sort of horrifying outputs from coming out of these systems is really a foundational challenge. On the one hand, because the process is mathematical in nature, you can open it up and dissect it and understand every last detail of how it got to its result. On the other hand, there's so much complexity going on there that it can be hard to connect what it does to our understanding. And to the extent that a machine is much better than us at some task, much smarter than us, it may be difficult to understand why it does what it does. Just as if a person is much better than me at, let's say, playing chess, they will beat me and I don't even know what they did to me. Right? There's some fundamental misunderstanding, inability to understand something that's much better than you at something.
Well, and I think the point.
And so that becomes a real challenge. How do we govern that? How do we avoid bad outcomes?
And point that Scott raised around bias is fascinating because there is this question of can an AI system be biased? And much of the conversation generally resides around will the algorithm itself will the math have a biased outcome? But when you look at how AI trains and learns, so basically the basic mechanism is to put a lot of data through an AI system, and based on the data it sees, the algorithm will, for instance, find patterns that help it identify things. And the challenge with that is the data that exists in the world is full of our own human bias. So there was a fascinating paper that was actually connected to a woman who's at Princeton now that looked at the fact that if an AI looks at the web data, it will decide that a flower is more pleasant than a bee. Now that is our own human experience to define that a flower is more pleasant than a bee. It's clearly not the bee's experience. So what is the right experience? And I mean to be really basic about that because it's a very good example. But then you also look at the data the world data says that names that are male and European sounding are more aligned with success. And so therefore, if you're an HR system looking to hire someone, that HR system will follow the data. Now, if you decide then to either as a business or a political process decide to change that and decide to have a different outcome be determined, then you get into a really gnarly question of what outcome do you want, right?
Yep.
Yes.
And that makes it very challenging.
That's the point I was going to make, is I don't think these AI algorithms are biased. The problem is the data that goes into them is often biased in ways that we don't even understand.
Yeah.
I think, I don't know if this is a positive or a negative, but I think it's going to bring to the forefront some really complex issues that as a society we've tried to avoid. The value of a human life. These are all things that are inherent in a number of policy decisions that we make as human beings every day, but we kind of ignore the underlying math. And AI is going to bring it forward. And I tell you, over the weekend, I saw Craig Ventner, I think I'm butchering his last name, but the Human Longevity Project leader. He's starting to offer personalized medical services where he will literally codify your genome, and then they're using AI to determine, what level of care will you be most responsive to. And I think that's enormously exciting. But then when you think about it, the natural extension of that is different levels of care will be provided to you based on your genome and your underlying responsiveness to it. And as a society, what do we think about that? Those are tricky questions.
So a question I'd open up to all of you is, frequently when we talk about AI, there are a handful of companies that always come to top of mind. It's the big tech companies, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, IBM. But as we've talked about, it touches a lot more. I'm interested in both your perspective of how do you see these technologies affecting competition with smaller companies, but also how it affects other companies and other industries that are now competing with these quote-unquote tech companies.
Let me take a cut at that. There are really three factors that have been driving the huge surge of progress in AI. One of them is access to big data sets. Second is access to large, more powerful computers or arrays of computers. And the third is improvements in the technical algorithms, which fundamentally come from the elite AI talent. And so in order to be a player in the AI field, in order to really be at the forefront of the field, you need to have access to a lot of data, big computers, and a lot of talent. All those things are expensive, and many of the companies whose names you would think of have been accumulating all of those things very aggressively over recent years. And so if you're a new entrant, you're trying to get into the business, all three of those things will be hard for you to get. Probably the one that's easiest to get is big computers because you can hire that. But talent will be very expensive, difficult to recruit, and data also will be difficult to get if you're starting from zero.
Scott, how do you think about that in terms of looking at small companies?
Yeah, so I do a lot of consulting to big Fortune 500 companies on innovation, and I tell you, there is an enormous push and kind of realization on their front that I think the time is theirs. It's time to seize the day. I think AI and ML are going to be as transformative as the internet, but in a very different way. The internet leveled the playing field, so it allowed the startups to compete against the big boys. Whereas big data, I'd argue, or AI and machine learning, big data is the fuel to that engine. So the advantage goes to whoever has the data. And I'd argue the incumbents are in a better position to have the data. So I'm seeing a lot of interest and activity from the biggest companies. Whether or not it's a Caterpillar, a ConAgra, companies you don't normally think of as tech companies are absolutely focused on becoming data-driven businesses. They're thinking about strategic data acquisition. And I think it's going to be a fascinating dynamic and very different than the 1990s where the internet leveled that playing field. You're going to have situations where, Amazon's lead now in consumer product recommendations is daunting. And I tell you, something we think about a lot as investors is how can anybody catch up? Because the sheer amount of data that they're bringing in every second to improve that AI and ML, nobody else has access to that data. Same thing's going to happen with driving. I made a comment earlier about whoever has access to urban driving data. That's what really teaches the cars and the autonomous vehicles to drive. Enormous advantage if you can capture that data.
And Kim, how do you think about this when you think about clients or potential clients who are not classic tech companies and how they think about these issues? How do they think about advocating for themselves, but also and just generally getting a deep enough understanding to understand how to communicate with people here?
I just think it's important for any company that is involved in any way with artificial intelligence, whether it's because you're going to automate some parts of your business and therefore there might be some employment impacts, or whether you collect, you're a consumer-facing company and you collect a lot of data and you're going to run that through and try to, refine that and use that. If that's part of your business, I think you have to think about a plan for either a reactive plan or a proactive plan, but you've got to bake that into your government relations. Because if worst case scenario, you're Marissa Mayer and you get subpoenaed by the Senate Commerce Committee to come testify about why Yahoo had such an enormous breach of consumer data and didn't disclose any of it until well after the fact, or you partner with another company who's in that situation. So I think the worst situation for a CEO and the people you advise within your companies is to be exposed and not have a plan and be scrambling. So it's worth some thought because it's more and more the focus of policymakers and regulators. Not so much on the front end about regulating business relationships, but that'll still be the marketplace, I think. But this privacy issue and the maybe implicit biases within the data and the impacts that have, eventually I think it's going to impact every company. There's a hearing next week in the Senate Commerce Committee about farming and data. So it's all about precision agriculture, and I mean the topic of the hearing is really about trying to get better broadband capacity in rural areas so that farmers can use some of these new technology tools to be more efficient in production of food and agriculture. But implicit in that is also the risk of using Internet of Things devices that aren't secure and data that can get out there, exposed. And so people need to be thinking about that as part of their strategic plan for government relations, as how you're going to deal with, either in a crisis communication standpoint or, from a policy standpoint, how you're going to deal with it.
And it's different from an issue where it could have been Bob who was making a whole bunch of decisions for the company. You now have an AI system with some other name that sounds more Terminator-ish, making decisions for that company. And I can imagine being an executive.
Hal, let's just say Hal.
Hal, let's call it Hal. That's good. Thank you.
I think,
And that makes it difficult for an executive to stand up and say, well, so Bob goes off and he makes these decisions, but then Hal, and you're expected to know how Hal makes a decision.
You're expected to know, but at the end of the day, ultimately, you're going to be held accountable. Because I think anything other than that sounds like the devil made me do it. You are responsible for the technology in your company, and you need to be aware of how it's being used. You need to be, I think if anything came out of the Equifax hearings from a few weeks ago where the former CEO was dragged up to Congress, his lack of awareness of his own internal processes and procedures for how you deal with software updates and different things like that was astonishing. And these are members of Congress who, for the most part, pretty much give businesses a blank check. They are not going to second guess business decisions. You had Republicans who, were really upset, and it's going to continue. The fallout is pretty vast. There are at least 5 or 6 congressional committees that are looking at not just the Equifax breach, but sort of all the related issues. So I think, the people who are briefing the CEO can't escape responsibility, and you're going to have to be making sure your boss is up to speed and at least has a conversant sort of knowledge about what's happening within the company. That's my view.
Yeah. You're going to have to be able to answer the question, what are you doing to prevent your customers or citizens' data from leaking out of your company? And similarly, in areas when you replace Bob in HR by Hal in HR to make decisions about who to interview, who to hire, you're going to need to be able to explain what you're doing to make sure that Hal is not discriminating. And maybe you knew how to keep Bob from discriminating, or at least you knew what you were doing to prevent it. You need to have an equally good and persuasive answer with respect to Hal.
So Ed, you've served as an expert on technology topics broadly for quite some time and been involved in testifying over many years. Do you think that these topics and these issues are more complicated? As a technologist, do you find these more complicated to talk to people who are not technology? Or not technologists?
Yeah, I think they are complicated.
Or are they just new? I'm just trying to get it, are they both new and more complicated?
I think both. Yeah. If you look at data privacy, which is an issue that's been around for longer, at the end of the day, the explanation that you're going to give is going to be something like, we followed best practices. There's a set of accepted best practices in our industry or in the technical field generally, and we were fairly diligent about following those. And I think where this issue of discrimination or unfairness or unwanted results from AI and machine learning will go is also in a direction of best practices, right? We don't yet have those best practices. They haven't yet emerged, There's not yet consensus on what they are, but I think that those will emerge. And the answer to the what were you doing question to prevent a bad outcome is going to be, well, here's a list of accepted practices, and here's what we were doing. And yes, the CEO, yes, the senior management of our company were paying attention to whether we were doing these things. But in the meantime, there's a lot of question marks.
There's a lot of question marks, and so, I would advise companies that you need to come up with internally your best effort to make some best practices, to say, we weren't just winging it, we weren't, we were paying attention, and, based on our expertise and what we got from others, this is what we tried to follow. Eventually, as Ed's saying, the industry gets there. They're kind of forced to get there through either investors like Scott or insurance or other external factors that require them to come up with this, usually not generated through policy channels necessarily. But I think in this kind of Wild West time, you need to be thinking about, or companies need to be thinking about, are we following, does what we're doing pass the laugh test? Can we detect rubles versus dollars when, ads are being purchased? Just basic kind of stuff like that.
Or I guess for all of you, how do you think about bridging this gap between there's the expert knowledge, and frequently talk about the fact that most of the AI all-stars all have gray hair, because it is a highly experiential technology. It's not something that you can go through and study as an undergrad and automatically be an experience. As you said, it's an apprenticeship business. It's quite different from a lot of other true just programming. So you have this one end of the spectrum of great knowledge all the way through to not a lot of knowledge, as we said in the Senate, or I would imagine with your limited partners that invest in, behind the fund, et cetera. How do you think about, you're all in a communication role here, how do you think about trying to help people understand AI and data and all of the issues around it well enough to be able to do their jobs without sending them off on a Coursera course,
Well, Coursera is a portfolio company, so it's fine to send them to a Coursera course. I'd say we view it as a huge investment opportunity. We're investing pretty heavily in what I'd call democratization platforms for AI and ML. As an example, we're investors in a company, Data Robot. And one of their kind of catchphrases is they try to turn a French lit major, or enable you to turn a French lit major into a robust data scientist. So I think that's an enormous opportunity. But you're absolutely right. The talent frenzy in the Valley, it's crazy. It's Facebook, it's Google, it's Baidu, it's Amazon. I mean, they're writing 7-figure checks to young folks who are PhDs in AI and ML. So it makes it very difficult for traditional businesses to get that talent. But again, I think the tools are going to come. Some of these democratization platforms, I had a meeting with some large hedge funds, showed them the technology. Their reaction was priceless. They were actually upset. They're like, hey, wait a minute, this is going to take away our edge. Because the way they'd made money is by hiring tons of, be honest, Russian PhDs who are brilliant with math, and they viewed that as their trading angle. Now with a platform like this, anybody can have access to that, that level of insight to the numbers. Because I'm not sure you all are aware, I don't think it's common knowledge, but AI and ML algorithms, most of the most effective, they're open source because they come out of academia. The trick is to know what to apply when and how to get cleansed data with signal.
And there's some companies that do that have focused quite a lot on purely using open source. It's interesting. Adobe, a very large tech company, has very in-depth research in creating new algorithms, mostly for image processing, right? Really high-end creative stuff. But all of the algorithms they use in their marketing cloud services, their document cloud, all of the things that help you find things in PDFs, they're very clear about the fact that all of that is using open source. They say, look, there's no reason to go create new algorithms. It's all about having people who understand how to apply them and apply them to the big documents.
It's about how to connect the pieces together to solve your particular problem, right?
Exactly.
So when you talk about how a company can make sure that what they're doing is going to be justifiable if they're challenged, one of the big challenges is that you have over here a team of people who understand what are your corporate goals, and what is your responsibility, what are your compliance obligations. And over here you have a bunch of engineers who are making detailed decisions that govern what your product is actually going to do and how the decisions are actually going to be made, and making sure that those teams are somehow in alignment so that there is a robust flow of information between them is a challenge. And what has often been successful is simply to have teams that are responsible for making sure that those things are in alignment, and to find that rare talent that is able to do the cross-cultural work between those different communities within your organization. The people who speak both languages, or at least know how to talk to both of those communities, and if they're empowered to actually cause change and force conversation when there's a misalignment, can do a lot. But if you're not trying to keep those things in sync, then I guarantee you they will be out of sync.
And it's a very different change than in previous big technologies. If you think about late 90s internet, you could have a little team over there that was building the .com thing that we have, right? They were off on the side. It didn't really matter. It wasn't part of the core business. Even early mobile, we had a crazy team that would go create an app, and most people would kind of ignore it because it was a thing off to the side. But so frequently, we're now embedding machine employees, right, of thinking it that way as an AI that's making a decision and having some form of agency, whether it's recommending which customers a salesperson calls on, all the way through to making trading decisions. But it's now this new, brand new technology is at the core of the business, making fundamental changes. It's no longer this thing off to the side that someday will catch up and integrate. It's
so now the worst case is really bad.
Yes.
Before, the worst case was just, oh, this thing doesn't take off.
It
Maybe
didn't
we
take
make a
off,
little
the
less
website
money.
crashed, who cares,
Yeah.
right? So we now would love to invite people to the mics on either side to ask questions of anyone up here. We have one going, so hold for just a sec. Please go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So I'm a mathematician, and I'm currently serving as Director of Government Affairs for the American Mathematical Society. And so first, thank you very much for discussing network science, a beautiful field that, from my area. So I want to talk about the, well, I guess to start out, our members, train PhD students in math and statistics and computer science at the intersection for the kind of jobs you're talking about, and we're having trouble keeping up. So PhD students, also undergraduates, our university's under huge strain to keep up with the demand for these kind of people. But a few of you have talked about, the sort of match between the deep content knowledge that our students are being produced with and then getting jobs in this world. And while there is demand, I wonder, as educators, what can we do to best address that match? And I wonder about things like, should they understand policy stuff? Should they understand business context, like you talked about Caterpillar? I mean, how many PhDs in math, understand that business sector? So advice from you or anybody in the room about what we can do to help bridge that or make that match work better would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Maybe I'll go first because I do teach some of these students. I think it's important for educators to pay attention to this, that if we're going to educate our students to be effective in the broad sense and not just sort of skilled with manipulating symbols, they do need to have an understanding of how these technologies operate in the world, and some kind of training in ethics or in thinking through the implications of application of the technology is important. And I do think there's a trend toward that happening. I know it's something that we've been doing at Princeton to try to integrate this more ethics discussion into the machine learning curriculum. Ultimately, this is going to have to happen. And students are smart enough to demand it. When it doesn't happen, I think it's often because people choose not to do it. Not that there's not a demand for this broader education from a lot of the students.
I think I completely agree on with that answer, but I also think there's an opportunity for partnerships between the universities and some of these large companies. My read on a lot of these students, I mean, they're brilliant, they're young, and they're going to completely understand these algorithms. They have little or no exposure to real world problems. It's one of my biggest frustrations when I go to the Valley and I see all these brilliant people, but they're so young, they just don't know where to kind of channel their talent. And that's why we wind up with 15 different mobile apps to help you find a parking space. I mean, it's, society doesn't need that. That's maybe in San Francisco and New York, and it's not going to scale anywhere else. So I think you can do these partnerships. I mean, I could imagine, Caterpillar going to work with, any university, and they could contribute data as well as some vertical understanding. And that can be a phenomenal way for the students then to learn how to apply the data to a real world problem. I think there's enormous opportunity for that. For what it's worth, I've been trying to push some of those thoughts to the administration who's looking for, getting internships in some of these programs going. And they're responsive.
So we need the reverse of physics for poets. We need poets for physicists, poetry for physicists.
Absolutely.
And somewhat honestly, a Coursera, course for the humanities for people who are coming out of these programs who actually need to understand, as you say, ethics, but also broader issues of business. How does this actually apply? How do you take math and apply it to agriculture? Which is another thing that is another sort of apprenticeship business. What do the crops grow? You're not going to find that out in the first month on the job. It kind of takes a couple crop cycles. To understand those things.
Another thing that I really think needs to be taught, or at least to be thought through, that we haven't touched on that much. We've touched about the risk of privacy breaches and the loss of data. We haven't talked about the impact of automation just on society. And I think that's going to be something that's incredibly difficult for us to wrestle with. It's not the first time our society's wrestled with it, though. We shifted from an agrarian society to a manufacturing society. But if you look at the number of states where truck driver is the #1 profession, it's stunning. Somebody did a wonderful map. Just Google it, and it is almost every state that voted for Trump. So it's already kind of that disadvantaged, the voter that feels disadvantaged and left behind. And imagine if their #1 job just gets wiped out. And that's going to come a lot faster than we think. And it's not just truck driving, it's manufacturing. We're seeing business plans for very sophisticated systems that are basically completely dark manufacturing plants. Everything is done soup to nuts by machines. The machine vision is there, the tactile touch. It's coming fast, and we as a society need to just think through, what does that mean? Because you can't slow it down. You can't tell a company you can't automate.
Yeah, you can't. Another question over here?
Hi, Bill Womack with Deloitte. I was going to ask a question, but I'm going to pivot based on what you just said. Have you seen any really thoughtful discussion, though, about the societal impacts of AI? Because it is pervasive, and certainly as our firm takes a look at all the myriad applications of AI and where they could land in an innumerable number of industries and sectors of the economy, the thing that continually pops up in the discussion, either in a robust way or, to me, surprisingly, in passing, the sea anchor that's going to be created by what I would guess to be a significant backlash from those who feel disadvantaged to what you actually can do.
This is a huge issue. This is one of the things that we tried to address in the White House reports. And there's several aspects to this. One is that this technology is going to have huge benefits. And in a couple ways. One is that AI will be, and machine learning will be applied to a lot of big challenges. Medical care will get much better because of personalized medicine. All kinds of things that we rely on will become more efficient and cheaper, and that's going to unlock a lot of opportunities. Number one. Number two, if this technology really is as transformative as we think it is in the workplace, that will drive a big improvement in productivity, worker productivity, right? And that is a major source of wealth and resources for our society. So that's all good, and we want to make sure we don't throw out that baby with the bathwater when we're concerned about the transformation. But the real issue, I think that's been referred to a few times here, is the changes in the workplace primarily. And the concern, I think, not so much about whether there will be enough jobs, but about whether the workers have skills that match what the job market is demanding. That skill mismatch problem is, I think, a really major challenge. And there's been a bunch of efforts to start up national conversations about this. One thing I would point to is the Rework America initiative that the Markle Foundation has put together, which is a broad, multi-stakeholder task force to look at exactly this issue. How can we try to collaboratively create a future in which is better for workers, and especially for the workers who might be disadvantaged by these changes?
Yeah. Another one is, I believe it's called the Shift Commission. Bloomberg and then I think Senator Mark Warner were behind it. They've done some good work on the topic.
This is also a topic it's important to understand that the answer to how much automation will impact any individual industry or job is frequently misunderstood. In that I would assume most of you know the headline that 47% of jobs will get automated in some period of time, says some experts at Oxford, right? That's not really what their study said. Actually, it's very clear it's not what their study said, and they've been quoted saying they've been misquoted. And at last year, well, before I joined Quartz, but part of the group that we were before we became Quartz, we did that exact same study. We actually did much deeper and broader, looked at 800 jobs across the economy and 130 things that everybody brings to work in terms of skills and activities and abilities. And you find that there are that there's frankly no job that can be purely automated, that there's a lot of partial automation. There's a lot of actually bringing a certain amount of automation into an individual job. That means that the big answer is there's clearly a big impact, but it's way more nuanced and way more complicated than a simple, clickable headline.
Right. So I think, I think what we can say with confidence, based on the studies that have been done, is that the effects of this will be felt unevenly across the economy, more in some sectors than others, more in some types of jobs, more in some locales than others. But we can't say exactly which jobs, exactly which locales or sectors will be hit the hardest. And even basic distributional questions like, will the burden fall more heavily on lower wage, lower income, lower education workers or not? Even those questions we cannot answer with confidence, I think, based on the state of knowledge now.
And I'm just going to jump in and say that, from a policy perspective, policymakers are definitely looking at these issues, not so much to stop it, trying to understand it, and then trying to figure out if there are government programs or ways to help people transition, how do those need to change? But I think companies need to think about if they're going to have displacement of workers, to offset the negative attention they're going to be getting or the scrutiny, they ought to be thinking about what can they do in a proactive way. So for example, IBM is talking about how to retrain people. Most of the tech companies have programs that are trying to make sure people get the skills, retrain people, have them acquire skills so that they can do some of these new jobs too, and not just waiting on the government to come up with some program, trying to be proactive and do it, as responsible corporate citizens.
Great. Next question.
Sure, thanks. Rebecca Hershey from Goodwill Industries International. Our Goodwill organizations are across the country heavily involved in upskilling and education of lower wage workers in digital skills. But I'm interested in something that was said earlier about a lack of socioeconomic background diversity in the people who end up on the creation, innovation, invention end of this. You mentioned people don't have real world skills. They haven't had to solve real world problems. We have thousands of people who have grown up, been educated, solving real world problems, not looking for a parking space, but they're not in the pipeline to the places you're talking about right now. How do you envision creating more opportunity for those talented individuals to get into that pipeline, both from a policy perspective and action?
Man, it's a great question. You know, in the venture industry, obviously we're under heat, as we should be. You know, it's a profession dominated by white males, and it shouldn't be. A lot of it stems from kind of how we've traditionally hired. You know, we tend to go get the best and the brightest from the top investment banks. Lo and behold, they tend to be, you know, it just kind of perpetuates through the system. I'd say, again, and I don't want to make it sound like I'm always trying to turn to technology for the answer, but we've backed a company called Litmus that's doing some pretty interesting things on the technical front to open up opportunities to people who don't necessarily have the same academic pedigree. Think of Litmus as a cloud-based program to literally test people on a age, sex, race, gender blind way on whether or not they can actually perform the skills of the job. One of the things we found in technology is a lot of companies who write the job recs don't know how to write a technical job rec. They'll say they want a full stack Java developer. When you actually look at the role, they don't. And so if they hired a full stack Java developer, they'd be overpaying by a factor of 2. So Litmus tries to help large companies write better requirements. And then from that, it generates an automated set of testing questions that somebody can then go in and log in. And one of the wonderful things that the Valley's seeing come out of Litmus is much more women, you know, because people mention the issue on names of resumes. Mm-hmm. You can do studies that show if somebody sees the name of a resume, you know, my name's Scott Frederick is just going to come out as, you know, I'm a white male. And that tends to be advantaged in the process. So Litmus does away with those biases. And I'm excited about things like that to level the playing field. And it is allowing people with very little traditional academic background to get some spectacular jobs because they have skills. You know, we're not sure where they got them, but they learned them, and that's wonderful. So I'm not sure I really answered the question, but it's a tough question.
So I mean, this goes to core social challenges around access to quality education. And I think one of the, and that's a longstanding problem, one of the positive trends in this area has been universities, I think, doing more in recent years to try to create more paths into higher education for students who sort of come in through non-traditional paths, and paying more attention to socioeconomic and class diversity in their student populations. And that's part of the answer, right? To bring in people who have different life experience and who come from different places and who see different problems in society to address. Another thing that I see as a university teacher is a real hunger among students to work on problems that matter as a way to build their skills. And so there are opportunities to do matchmaking, to take all of this energy that students have and this idealism that they have, and as they acquire technical skills, and to actually apply it in a productive way to problems that matter more than helping you and I find parking spots.
If I could add one upbeat anecdote to that, I was just meeting with some very large financial services companies that were complaining that they couldn't get top AI talent. And it was kind of funny the way they had this woe is me argument. They're like, yeah, these damn students want to work on, you know, socially impactful problems. Nobody wants to just make money anymore. And I thought that was really encouraging.
So I would leave one more question. We only have a couple minutes here, so just one more question for each of you. To flip the topic around and to say, what would you advise your children or other children to study in college? So this whole question of automation and AI and all of those other things. So it's an interesting question. We just go down the row and say, what would you advise your children to study in college, and essentially what kind of career would you say they should be pursuing for the next, you know, few decades? Start with, go ahead.
I have 2 children in college, one in high school, and I just, maybe I'm a bad mom, but I've never presumed to try to, you know, I just tell them that they should find something that they enjoy doing and that the rest of it will work out, because you're going to be working your whole life. It better be something that you really enjoy, and just try to expose them to as many different things as possible. So yeah, I'm definitely not a tiger mom.
So I have a kid in college now, and my advice is and was major in whatever you want, whatever your passion is, but do study and get some basic understanding of science and technology, because it is going to be central to almost whatever you do. You will have to know those things. And then recognize that your career path will not be a straight path from the gates at graduation to retirement. That you're going to have to be adaptive and learn and continue to develop your skills as you go, because it will be an economy that requires more agility.
I couldn't agree more on the passion angle. I think your job can either give you energy or it can suck it out of you. So I wholly endorse that. If I were going for one skill, I mean, I'd say AI ML. I mean, it is the future.
Yeah, I like that. I wish Ed had advised my kids.
Well, I'll tell you what, we actually wrote an article on this at the beginning of the year, and because we flipped our automation study on its head, and we looked and we said what was going to be automated, what was not going to be automated. The overarching theme is things that are unpredictable. So we grouped it into three things. Focus on things that are about people, because people are fundamentally unpredictable. Second is structures, because you have to build them in a physical world. The physical world is an unpredictable and difficult thing for an AI to understand. And the last one was interesting, bugs. Immunology, those kinds of things. It's just, it turns out that there's some skill set there that's really creative. So people, structures, bugs. Anyway, thank you very much to all three of you. Really appreciate it. Thank you all for your great attention and questions.
See if I can get down. Thank you.
Please welcome Luke Hartig, Executive Director of National Journal's Network Science Initiative.
That was good.
That was fun.
That was good.
Please welcome Charlie Cook, Editor and Publisher of The Cook.
Just to clarify, I'm Luke Hartig, not Charlie Cook, in case you're expecting somebody else. Charlie will be up next. Well, thank you very much for joining us here today, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you a bit more about some of the work we're doing at National Journal in the field of network science. Network science for us is essentially a fancy term of saying an analytically rigorous approach to stakeholder mapping. And what we've done in Washington over the last 2 years is apply the field of network science toward understanding how social networks, professional networks, and influence operates in Washington. We've been doing this with about 50 organizations. And what I want to do today is just share some lessons learned and some ideas on how you can think about doing this within your own offices. So a couple of things we should say at the outset, and we have some terminology here to get us going. Network science at its core is about understanding people and organizations and understanding the connections among them and how those connections lead them to cluster, to form communities with other people. Incredibly useful in a range of fields. It's been used in computer science for 20 plus years, but I think it really gets excited when you think about how network science is applied to understanding human networks. And it's been absolutely groundbreaking in the fields of epidemiology, law enforcement, intelligence. And that's actually where I first came to this field. I spent several years in the counterterrorism community before I joined National Journal. And I spent my days tracking guys like this. This is one of the Paris attackers. If you have read anything about counterterrorism over the last few years, you know that network science has been at the center of everything we've done for the last 16 years in combating terrorist networks. If you saw Zero Dark 30, you know that it was understanding that the courier network was the vulnerability for bin Laden that allowed us to get to bin Laden. Now, this same methodology can also apply to thinking about how to reach hard-to-reach people in Washington. If you look at a guy like Kevin McCarthy, who influences Kevin McCarthy? Who does he influence? And perhaps most importantly for people in this room, how do you think about getting in with him? How do you think about understanding that network to your advantage? It can also be useful for understanding large amounts of data and how that operates around policy debates. This right here is a cloud of data that we generated. It's about 5,000 people and organizations that we assess are the most influential organizations in Washington on Medicaid reform, on drug pricing, on tax reform, and on the opioid epidemic. When you start to look at this data set and get a feel for different people and who are the people who can touch on multiples of those debates, and how do the communities that are shaping those debates actually cluster together. Let's zoom in on a cloud of data to see kind of how this actually comes to life. This is actually a different cloud of data. This depicts cold and flu vectors within a high school. And if you look at this guy in the middle with the big orange line going to him, this is the central node in this system. This is the guy who is receiving and passing more cold and flu from one side of the network to every other side of the network. And so if you're a public health official, you want to figure out, how do I get to that guy? How do I teach that guy to wash his hands, or however else he's passing these diseases? In Washington, you might be looking for somebody who's a little bit different. You're looking for somebody who might be that somewhat anonymous staffer who is writing the memos, who is shaping the policy, but you're not going to read about him in the front page of the New York Times. For purposes of illustration, we have Jeet Guram, who's a senior advisor at HHS, working on innovation in the fields of Medicare and Medicaid. He's a guy who's about 30 years old, newcomer to Washington, first stint in government, but he's somebody that if you start to look at his network and what he's been able to do in his 30 years or so and getting an MD and an MBA, both from Harvard, you see that he has these incredible set of connections to the private sector, to GOP health policy wonks, and ultimately to some of the people who matter most, which is to say the leadership of HHS. So understanding that network gives you an idea of how do you actually shape and understand Jeet Guram's worldview. Which I think brings us to another really important point, because in Washington, it's not enough to just be that centrally located guy in a high school who reaches out to everybody and passes cold and flu. You're looking for somebody who actually has some real authority on an issue. And so for us, when we think about influence in Washington, we think about it in the network sense as a function of connectivity and authority. Connectivity could be that person you know who's just connected to everybody you can think of in Washington, or it could be the relatively anonymous staffer who has a couple of very strong ties to very powerful people in the administration or in the Congress or otherwise. Authority, this is one thing we've found, which is that authority is really hard to manufacture on the fly. You either know what you're talking about an issue or you don't. A good advocate can find an authoritative voice from outside the Beltway and help them build the connectivity and help them build up that overall influence level, but authority, you kind of have it or you don't. So let's talk about how we actually do this, how you actually bring this to life. And I want to offer 7 lessons for thinking about applying this in your offices and beyond. So first, you got to begin with what a former boss of mine called the network of networks, understanding the system. And when we started doing this work, we sort of conceived of Washington as a series of concentric circles. And in the middle of all of these circles was the administration and the Congress. And everybody else is just trying to influence them. And while that's not an inaccurate way of looking at Washington, I think what we found is that depending on the maturity of a particular debate, the really exciting policy conversation might be happening in think tanks. It might be happening in the social media space. Or increasingly, it might be coming from people who are sort of these, if you look in kind of the southwest corner, these kind of non-policy influentials. That's to say, individual citizens who have had a particular interaction or an experience that's led them to take action. Now, often they're enabled by other players in this system, but what we increasingly find is, there are these new players bursting on the scene, and they didn't really even know where they come from. So we start with this kind of inventory and checklist that you're going to walk through whenever you're thinking about stakeholders. The second thing is that good network science starts with good strategy. We've laid out a couple of different strategies on the left, and depending on what that strategy looks like, you'll have different areas of focus and stakeholders that you want to research. So if it's a purely legislative play and you're trying to shape a handful of legislators, you might be trying to find every single possible pathway into them, through their friends, through their family, through their local ties. If it's a thought leadership case, something that a lot of people in Washington are talking about these days, you might be looking at bringing in outside voices who can help you really shape the debate in a useful way. You might be looking at those conveners that have authority across a whole range of areas. You might be looking at your CEO and figuring out how your CEO or other executives can utilize their credibility and their network ties to actually shape a policy issue. But any one of those things, any one of those strategies is going to lead you to research a different set of people and research the people who can help you actually influence your outcome. Third, for a town that is all about insider information, what we've found is that the network is actually hiding in plain sight. If you move beyond the front page of the New York Times and you look at some really obscure media sources, maybe those are trade publications, maybe those are alumni magazine, maybe they're random blogs, maybe they're wedding announcements or obituaries, you find connections among people that you just wouldn't expect to find in the public domain. Similarly, scouring public records, whether that's disclosures to the FEC, lobbying disclosures, IRS, et cetera, there's a lot out there that's publicly required to be disclosed. And what we found is that Freedom of Information Act can tell you a lot, even on regulatory issues, where if you've tried to FOIA some of those issues, you usually get back an answer of, this is protected by the deliberative process, and so we're not going to tell you the nuggets you want. You actually find out a great deal about who's connected with whom, who has a degree of affinity among one another, and what those networks actually look like within agencies. Lesson 4, and let's get into some of the actual networks. We always start by saying, what is the debate about and what is the implications for the stakeholders? So I'll start with one that you all know very well, the tax reform debate. We started tracking tax reform back in February. And at that time, when it was all about Paul Ryan's Better Way plan and the border adjustment tax, the question was, what is a border adjustment tax? And if you're for it, great, how do I get that to be reinforced? And if you have some concerns about it based on your industry or otherwise, who are the people out there picking holes in those arguments? And so the relevant stakeholders for us were some of these core academics who really understood the details of it, and some of the more ideologically aligned groups that were pushing for or against it. And a lot of people are kind of keeping their powder dry. Now that we're in a place of rate cuts with a set of pay-fors, we're in a much more traditional lobbying exercise. And so it is that, what are those creative pathways to the key decision makers and their staff? And ultimately, how do you form the right kinds of coalitions and connections that are going to help you shape the outcome of this? It can also be useful to understand the nature of the debate and the networks and figure out what you're going to do with your strategy. So up here, we've depicted the data sets for a couple of projects we've worked on. On the left, you have child vaccines. In the lower part of that, the green cluster is the anti-vaccination crowd, and the purple cluster is the pro-vaccination crowd. As you can see, very few voices that cross between those places. You're not going to co-opt people. You're not going to bring people on board. You have to think about your opposition as sort of fundamentally lost to you, and it's about understanding where they're going to go, get there first, expose maybe some of their networks and their tactics, build up alliances in a place so that you can prevent them from taking root. Whereas on the right, this is the pharmaceutical pricing debate. And I don't mean to mitigate any of the passions and the views around pharmaceutical pricing, which there are quite a few. But from a network perspective, it's a much more tightly interconnected group of people. And there is some real opportunity, we think, to be able to shape different players in that debate to ultimately build kind of the winning coalition. Lesson 5, and this has particularly been useful when you think about the Trump administration, but anytime there's a new organization or a new Congress that's forming, is what are the leading indicators? When you're forming something up, what we found in social networks is that the first couple of players start to define the overall network. And so we've broken this down into a couple of archetypes. One is the first movers. As folks who were closely tracking the foreign policy debates last year would know, there was a stronger never Trump movement among the GOP foreign policy crowd than any other GOP policy community. And what it meant that is that a lot of these people weren't going to get jobs when Mr. Trump won the presidency. And there were a couple of exceptions in there. One was that Ed Meese, the former attorney general, was on the transition team. And his son is a guy named Mike Meese, who's a retired one-star general, who's a military intellectual, very close with General Petraeus, very close with a number of professors who've taught at West Point, who've taught at the war colleges. And lo and behold, a lot of those players, including McMaster, who's pretty clearly in that crowd, have found their way into the administration. Another thing that we've all seen, there are great cultivators of talent around Washington. Jeff Sessions is one in this administration. Bob Dole is oddly one in this administration. We see a lot of Bob Dole ties in this administration. In the last administration, there were a lot of Joe Biden people who found their way around. One that popped up to us as somewhat unexpected was former Representative Bill Thomas, who was chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. And 4 of his top staffers have moved into some pretty prominent positions on tax reform within the Congress and on a range of healthcare issues. Perhaps the most interesting person you're looking for in some of these debates is the cross-pollinator, somebody who touches on multiple different areas. You can walk in many worlds. And for us, one of the guys who's jumped out the most on that, particularly on taxes, is Stephen Moore. He's an economist by training. He wrote President Trump's, or then candidate Trump's, campaign tax plans. And he's a guy who has some deep ties into the academic world as well as the activist world. He says that his 2 closest intellectual influencers in his life have been Art Laffer and Ed Feulner. Art Laffer, the noted supply-side economist, brings him deeply into that supply-side economics space, and Ed Feulner into a broader realm of conservative intellectuals, many of whom have shaped the budget policy of this administration already. He's also done quite a few other things. He founded the Club for Growth, subsequently had kind of an unceremonious falling out with them. He was a longtime columnist for the Wall Street Journal. He works with ALEC. His most recent venture is the Committee to Unleash American Prosperity, which is this interesting confluence of conservative academics and some of the conservative businessmen, guys like Harold Hamm and Andrew Puzder, who've been major drivers in this administration and Republican politics over the last few years. Lesson 6. Sometimes these debates just seem so entrenched and so hard to break through that you have to really think about what some of the non-adversarial types of pathways might be. One of the things we've seen in the Trump administration in particular is that the business ties are extremely deep. And if you track the network of investors in New York, you find a lot of really interesting players who pop up. So we'll take as an example, understanding Jared Kushner's network. His brother, Josh Kushner, has founded 2 companies, one of which, Oscar, a healthcare company, received $175 million in funding through Series A, B, and C funding from Peter Thiel. So you look at Peter Thiel, kind of a classic libertarian. How did he end up close with the populist? There are other pathways to be sure, but one of which is a strong business relationship with the Kushner family. Similarly, sometimes you look at charitable organizations, and these are a great way for people on different sides of an issue to actually come together around a common cause. One unconventional, I guess, convener of power that we've seen is the remarkable number of conservative economists and Wall Street financiers, many of whom are now in senior economic policy making roles in this administration, who served on the board of New York Presbyterian Hospital at some point or another. There are, of course, the Common Ground conveners as well. These organizations, I think, are probably pretty familiar to a lot of the folks in the room. Those organizations that build a common cause, whether it's preventing child hunger and bringing together folks from different sides of the food debate, or Alliance to Save Energy, which has done a lot of great work in building bridges in a world where it seems hard to build bridges. And those are also ones that we find that a lot of organizations are targeting as ways to have non-adversarial conversations. Lesson 7. We think it is really important to think very creatively about business influence and understanding business influence, particularly on members. It's not enough to just look at donations, whether it's PAC or individual. You have to oftentimes think about economic footprint. What we found is that if you look at any state and say who's the top employer, it's almost always Walmart and AT&T or some combination of some of the biggest companies in America. And actually a better indicator of some of the influence that companies might be having on a member is whether they have a significant economic footprint there, starting with do they have a headquarters that's actually stationed in that state? So you look at Corey Gardner, a guy who's been pretty friendly to a range of fossil fuel interests as well as mining interests. And lo and behold, there are 4 Fortune 1000 companies that have headquarters in Colorado and work in that space. When you start to unpack that a little bit, you find a much more complex web of influence around Senator Gardner. Similarly, it might not be a headquarters element. It might be just a major business unit or component of the business that's based in a particular place. The defense industry, of course, has been good at doing this for years, where they have, the F-22 is made in 50 different states, so there's sort of a broad political reach based on that economic footprint. We look at professional services firms, EY, McKinsey. You're not talking about huge employment numbers, but you're typically talking about some pretty well compensated and therefore well-connected folks who are in a range of different places. The most interesting, or the most recent debate around Amazon and where Amazon's going to land. Wherever they land, I imagine there's going to be some strong political ties as well. Alma mater can be huge. Joe Donnelly is extremely close with Notre Dame. He went to Notre Dame. His wife works at Notre Dame. Notre Dame's board of directors has some real titans of business on their board. Gary Cohn, similarly heavily involved in AU, his alma mater. And finally, this web of third-party players is just become more complex as we moved along. There is patronage to traditional third-party groups and think tanks. So the Brookings Institution I put up there in particular but there are a whole range of think tanks that have been very closely tied to industry. There are shadow groups that carry out strategies that their funders would rather not be directly associated with. And then there are think tanks that are doing a little bit more kind of industry-specific support. So Institute for Energy Research has had a huge impact on the Trump administration and is doing a lot of interesting research that is generally pretty closely aligned with the fossil fuel industry. Finally, just a couple of closing thoughts before I end. When you think about doing this work, there's a couple of big principles that stand out and go across the board. One of which is to map relentlessly. That's what we do. We have a team of 15 people who track networks all day, but it doesn't have to be a big team like that. Whether you've done a base level of research or you're identifying different ties through your kids' soccer team or through whatever social networks that you might have, putting those down, making sure you document those so that you have the massive map of how your company is connected to the places you want to be, we found is kind of the critical first piece in keeping that updated. The second piece is that the network map is really a collaboration tool. I have one partner I work with who takes a kind of a basic spider graph, some of what you saw earlier, like the Kevin McCarthy thing, and builds out and puts it up on his wall and actually has people come to his office and draw additional lines in there and actually build this out. So it becomes a tool for a team of thinking about, oh, I know this guy, I was in his wedding, and maybe that's a way that we can get this inroad in. But it's not enough to just understand the network and analyze it. Then you actually have to work with it and to collaborate around it and to execute on it. So thank you very much for your time. I will be around later on, happy to follow up with any specific questions. But thank you so much for being with us today.
Welcome back, Kevin. Please welcome Charlie Cook, editor and publisher of the Cook Political Report and political analyst for National Journal. Please welcome back Kevin Turpin, president of National Journal.
Or not. Anyway, let me just spend 15 seconds. No, your eyes are not deceiving you. Those who know me, I have lost about 90 pounds. I had a cardiologist scare the hell out of me back in January, and so I lost 30 and then had gastric bypass and have lost 50 more. And thank you. So, and the only reason I say that is my intern has warned me. He said people are going to think you have cancer, and so you need to let them know that that's what is the case. But I'm sorry, Kevin, we have nothing to talk about. I always love doing these. National Journal members are always just such just smart, knowledgeable, connected people, and get to see old friends. And anyway, it's always just a heck of a lot of fun to do these. My sort of set piece thing, this is going to be a little different because stuff happened yesterday. The thing is that we had seen some special elections this year. And, you could say Democrats were 0 for 4 in terms of House races, congressional races that could theoretically have switched. But frankly, 3 of them, Montana, South Carolina, and Kansas, were big rural states, or, big districts with substantial rural small town populations. That's not where Democrats have been doing well lately, and quite frankly, the path to a majority in the House isn't through small town and rural districts. So those didn't mean a whole lot. The Georgia 6 special election, now that was the real one, and that was one where Democrats had a really good chance. It was hard fought, a ton of money. Both Republicans did a really, really, really good job. It would have been nicer, perhaps, if Democrats ran somebody who lived in the district or was older than 29, but it was a hard-fought race, and it was a very legitimate win. So effectively, Republicans were 1-0 in special House races this year, in terms of meaningful ones. There had been 9 state legislative special elections over the course of the year. 8 of them switched from Republican to Democrat. 1 switched from Democrat to Republican. But hey, state legislative districts, they're kind of small, and, it's kind of dangerous to read too much into that. The president's job approval rating is about 37 to 39%. And, history and logic would tell you that that's a really, really, really bad sign for the party holding the White House. And, we know historically that when a president has a job approval rating of 50% or more, either the president's party, they either gain some seats, break even, lose a few, maybe 10, 12, 15, but nothing catastrophic. But when it's under 50, bad things start happening. And we also know that in the last 6 midterm elections, in 4 out of 6, either the House or the Senate or both changed hands. So pretty explosive results. And then the two exceptions, interestingly, are 98 after impeachment and 2002 election after 9/11. So, you know, pretty good reasons for those exceptions. But history and experience, or logic and history, you know, I've studied elections my entire adult life. Thought I'd gotten pretty good at it. History experience didn't work a whole lot in 2015 and 16, and so, you know, you don't know whether, you know, that if a president's approval rating was 38%, you know, you know, that party ought to lose a whole bunch of seats. But as I said, things have been kind of weird lately. Democrats had every reason to be optimistic going into Virginia, which was the biggest contest there. The state had been, you know, used to be Republican and had been trending from red to purple, heading towards blue. The state's not blue Democratic yet, but it's in that purple phase and closer to blue than it is to red. So it's going along with the trend line. We also know from history that the party in the White House usually loses the Virginia governor's race, for whatever that's worth if you buy into that. We know that President Obama carried the state twice. We know that Hillary Clinton won the state by 5 points. She won the popular vote nationally by 2, so did 3 points better than the national average. Terry McAuliffe had done a pretty good job and had a pretty good job approval rating. For those of you who live in the Washington area or elsewhere in Virginia, notwithstanding Ed Gillespie's ads, the state economy is doing pretty well. So, you know, shouldn't be a time for, you know, to be a time for a change in terms of Democrats there. Ralph Northam, he was reassuring, non-threatening, but also one of the most boring politicians you've ever met in your life. And boring people usually don't make horrible mistakes. And then finally, the polls were as consistent as state polls are. The average had a Northam lead. I think in the Real Clear Politics was like 3.3 percentage points. There were, I think, 2 polls that actually had 2 or 3 that had Gillespie ahead. There were just as many that had a double-digit lead for Northam, but you know, most of them were grouped around single digits. And we kind of learned from last year that the national polls were off a little bit. They averaged 3 points, a Clinton lead. She won by popular vote by 2. But where we completely missed that election was Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And between those 3 states, there were about 80 publicly released polls, 80, 85, and only 2 out of the 85 had Donald Trump ahead. And yet he carried all 3 of those states, 2 by 7/10 of a point and Michigan by 2/10 of a point. So we've learned that state polling, it's you know, there's a lot of garbage. There's some good ones out there. There's a lot of garbage out there. But so you have to be very, very careful. But the polls were pretty consistent, showing Northam ahead. About a week or so ago, Democrats started getting scared. And I think some of it, there was some tightening up of the polls in the race, but then again, they were also all over the map that I wouldn't want to emphasize that. I think probably the bigger thing was Democrats started having nightmares about a year ago, and how great things looked all the way up to Election Day, and then it was like their worst nightmares came true, so that they were kind of unnerved about that. And then on top of all of that, you had the Donna Brazile thing happen the last couple of days, and which, you know, probably wouldn't have made much of a difference, but it was the kind of thing that just scared the hell out of Democrats and kind of reminded them, it aired a lot of the party's dirty laundry and kind of reminded them of emails. Okay, so we get to the results. If you asked, thinking about Virginia particularly, but nationally, I think you could say without being contradicted, if you ask Republicans what was their most catastrophic possible scenario for yesterday, It was worse than that. If you ask Democrats what was their absolutely positively best case scenario, it was better than that. And the governor's race, to a certain extent, Northam winning by 9, but really look at the legislature. Now, in the House of Delegates, Republicans had a 66 to 34 majority. I'm sure someone, someplace, speculated about the possibility of Democrats winning a majority in the House of Delegates. I never heard anybody say that. I never read that anyplace. Democrats needed a 17-seat net gain to get a majority in the House of Delegates. As of now, last thing I saw, they were up 14 with a half dozen seats left undecided. So it's sort of roughly 50-50 on whether they get a majority in the House of Delegates, something that no one was talking about whatsoever. That you look elsewhere, the poll averages in New Jersey were about 13 points up for Phil Murphy, the Democrat. You know, between President Trump's approval rating, I mean, first of all, New Jersey is a Democratic-leaning state to begin with. President Trump has awful numbers there. And since David Bradley's not here, I'll say this. There are social diseases that have better numbers than Chris Christie does in New Jersey. So, you know, there was never, ever, ever any chance, or there hadn't been a chance in a long time that the Republican lieutenant governor could win. I mean, and the only way New Jersey's governor's race would be meaningful at all would be if Democrats just barely won it. And then people would say, with every advantage in the world, they just barely won it. But they ended up winning it by 13. Talked about the Virginia legislature. Maine, which is a fairly evenly divided state because you kind of have Portlandia, Portlandia East, and then you have, you know, the woods, the rest of the state, you know, so a kind of an interesting urban-rural split or urban-suburban-rural split, went overwhelmingly for Medicaid expansion. Georgia, Democrats picked up 2 seats, I think it was 2 seats in the legislature. Washington State, 1 or 2. Washington State, it looks like Democrats picked up 2 seats in the state Senate there, and it looks like they picked up a majority. You had an African-American woman pick up the the mayor's race in Charlotte, first one ever. So you just sort of, you look, oh, and I forgot that Democrats also picked up won the lieutenant governor and the attorney general's races in Virginia. So the thing is that the results in Virginia just could not possibly have been any better for Democrats than they were. So how should we interpret this? It'll take a little bit of time for us to for all the final numbers to come in and for us to really kind of digest it. But it's very, very clear that Democratic voters came out in really big numbers. It appears that minority voters came out in numbers that were comparable to a presidential and better than they did 4 years ago. That the Democratic intensity was it was definitely there. I wouldn't want to jump out front and say Republicans didn't show up or they vote. I don't know, because we'll have to kind of wait and see there. But clearly, what Democrats were looking for basically happened. So it's now, what effect will this have? Well, 2 immediate effects. Number one, I think we are already set to see a whole bunch of Republican retirements in the House. I think we were expecting that already, and I think we're going to get them. Now, most of the retirements don't matter because most of them are in safe Republican seats, so it's just a matter of changing names on doors. But to the extent that you have Republicans in competitive districts leaving for whatever reason, and whether it's Frank LoBiondo retiring or whether it's Martha McSally, who's expected to announce for the Senate shortly, but to the extent that it is competitive districts and Democrats have any kind of a tailwind at all, it puts the Republican majority in the House in more jeopardy. One thing, you all know me, I'm a politics guy, I'm not a policy guy, but let me just stray just a second into policy. I'm a bit of an outlier in town because I've thought for a long time, I was very skeptical about whether either A, major tax reform, or B, a major big tax cut or a huge tax cut. I have always been skeptical about it. Because the thing about, tax reform, under the best of circumstances, tax reform's hard. I mean, the fact that it was last done 31 years ago, that's a while. And think about who were the players back then. Ronald Reagan, who was a pretty damn good politician, His vice president, George H.W. Bush, was a former member of the House Ways and Means Committee. Jim Baker, one of the smartest operatives ever to work in Washington, was the Secretary of Treasury. You had up on the Hill, on the Republican side, you had Bob Dole, Bob Packwood, pretty heavyweight guys. On the Democratic side, you had Russell Long, Lloyd Benson, Danny Rostenkowski over on the House side. Plus, it was bipartisan. I mean, the genesis of the bill started off as Bradley Gephardt, a Democratic House member and a Democratic senator. So the thing about it is, even under those circumstances, it was a big lift to get it done. Now, think about the group of people that I've just talked about, from Reagan, Jim Baker, Russell Long, I mean, all of these people. Think about them. I would argue, my parents are both from South Arkansas, the runt of that litter would be the pick of this litter. I mean, there ain't nobody working on this that would have been that would be anything other than the weak person in the group back in '86. And then you look at, let's see, so far they're 0 for 3 in terms of meaningful things, meaningful legislative things. Supreme Court is not technically, legislative. And then you look at 52-48 in an intensely, Senate majority, an intensely partisan environment. So I'm very skeptical, have been very skeptical. And frankly, I think and the fact that Republicans couldn't agree, is this tax reform, which is what Paul Ryan and a lot of Republicans on the Hill were for, or is this a huge tax cut like what President Trump has been talking about? But the thing is, they can't even decide on what exactly it is that they want. I've been very, very, very skeptical. I think the best case scenario is that something passes that's relatively modest, and then Republicans are challenged to convince people that it was really, really big. And to me, that's the best case scenario. And there'll be some winners, some losers, but I don't think this is, and I think the fact that you could have nothing of any consequence happens is a real possibility. And so I think the challenge for Republicans is going to be, and this is where I think they've made a horrible mistake. You've had Republicans out there saying, we have to get a tax bill done. I've had a chairman of a committee, it wasn't Ways and Means, but a House chairman say, I asked, well, how are you going to get this done? This is a couple months ago. How are you going to get this done? He said, well, because we have to. I said, but how are you going to do it? Because we don't have any choice. We have to. And so I gave up after that because I kind of anticipated what the other answers were going to be. But the thing is that I saw some Republican quote saying this is existential. Our majority is gone if we don't pass it. Do you really want to say that? I mean, really? I mean, it's important. Wouldn't that have been sufficient, Because backing off the end of that limb and say, well, we still have a decent chance, we still could hang on to our majority, that's a pretty long way from existential, we absolutely have to do it to hold on to our majority. I think what you're going to see Republicans doing is this, or what I would do if I were them. I would get really busy. Well, first of all, there was that Pew study that came out back in, I think it was early September, or after the August recess started, Pew Research Center did a study where they took every piece of legislation that had passed this Congress, and they put them into two categories. Ceremonial, so, you know, naming courthouses and stuff, you know, National Phillips Head Screwdriver Week, you know, that kind of thing. And then the other side was, oh, there's the clock. I was wondering where it was. So the other side, they just labeled substantive. Now, not major, not significant, but just substantive. And they found that this Congress had actually so far had passed, as of August recess, more legislation than anyone in the last 11 or 12 years. Which, you know, I mean, I live here, I read I didn't feel that way, but, you know, sure. But I think they used the phrase admittedly generous in terms of what was substantive. So anyway, so there is that. I think what Republicans are going to end up having to do is, number one, start passing a lot of little and medium-sized things that might be beneficial to various people or seem somewhat popular. Pass a bunch of small, medium-sized stuff, take whatever they already did and try to play that stuff up more. And then the other side is to convince people that, okay, none of the big four things happen: repeal and replace Obamacare, $5 trillion infrastructure package, funding and building a border wall, probably taxes. We had done that, but you know, we have done, but the legislative agenda was meager, but try to kind of beef that up and do some hamburger helper on that. And then switch over to the other side, said, but there is meaningful change that is taking place in this country. And talk about, you know, what is happening. And I would use, and again, all these reg changes, you know, I'm not being judgmental about whether any reg is a good idea or a bad idea or should be kept or thrown out. But, you know, you've seen Douglas Holtz-Eakin, former budget director, a conservative, but they did some math, and I think this is in the presentation center slides, I'm pretty sure. But over the last 4 years of President George W. Bush's administration, the average cost of regulation was in the mid-40s, like $43 billion a year, something like that. Under Obama, it went up over $100 billion to, I kind of think it was $109 billion, but look at the presentation center slides. There. You know, now this is down to a trickle, and a lot of the regs that are passing are ones that are simply reversing ones that had happened under the Obama administration or even under Bush. So regulatory, virtually a 180-degree change. And number two is enforcement. That, you know, if you're on the business side, there's a new cop on the beat. And the new cop is a lot more flexible or cooperative than the jerk that was before, you know. And then, you know, again, from a business perspective, I would get that through. So regulatory plus just the enforcement itself. I would talk about the courts, and keep in mind, I mean, of course, with President Trump, his margin was just a touch under 79,000 votes scattered across 3 states. So, you know, you could almost say anything might have made the difference. But I personally think, in terms of more conventional establishment-oriented Republicans, I think a really decent-sized slice of the establishment Republicans voted for him for one simple reason: the courts. Or the Supreme Court, they may say. So you look at the courts and look at the Supreme Court. Let's assume for a second that President Trump gets no additional Supreme Court picks, just hypothetically. Just the one he did. Now, you know, everybody here knows there were 4 liberals on the court. There were 4 conservatives, including Scalia, and Anthony Kennedy was the swing vote. Okay, Scalia dies, so it's 4 libs, 3 conservatives. And President Obama nominates Merrick Garland, who, you know, is not nearly as liberal as a lot of other Democratic, or members of the court are, but he would have been left of center. So it would have gone to 5-3 with one in the middle. But instead, and even though they had to lower the standards down to 50, get 51 votes to get Neil Gorsuch through, the fact that that he is there instead. If Neil Gorsuch serves on the Supreme Court, this is a number worth remembering, until he is the age that Ruth Bader Ginsburg is today, he will be on the court in the year 2051. That's long after I'm going to be dead. I mean, because he's 50 years old. And then when you say, well, could there be any more vacancies? Well, of course there could, but when you think about it, Ruth Bader Ginsburg is 84. She's a liberal. Anthony Kennedy is 81, the swing vote. The next oldest on the court is Stephen Breyer, who's 79 years old, not a spring chicken. Then you have to go 10 more years to get to the oldest conservative on the court, Clarence Thomas, who's 69 years old. So if there is another vacancy, the odds are a heck of a lot higher that it's either a liberal or the swing vote, or that it's not a conservative. So you look at that and you say, wow. And then you think of the 13 U.S. Circuit Courts of Appeals and the 94, I think, U.S. District Court. So just judicially and putting young people on. So the thing about it is elections have consequences, and that one, despite having a very anemic legislative record, that one had huge consequences nevertheless. I think Republicans, that's a story that Republicans are going to need to start telling them, that election did matter, that they're wrong about that. So anyway, now let's talk about the midterm election. Everybody here knows, as I said, midterm elections make a difference, and I talked about the 50% mark, right? Yes. Yeah, approval rating up and down from 50? Yeah, I think I did. So that matters. You think about in the House of Representatives, and I'm virtually, well, we know the referenda, we know all except the most extreme circumstances, and I used as examples of exceptions impeachment and after 9/11. That in the House, and there is a slide for this, there have been 38 midterm elections since the end of the Civil War. The party in the White House has lost seats in 35 out of 38, which is 92%. So pretty strong pattern. Now, are there some reasons why Republicans maybe can keep their losses down to 23 or fewer seats and hold on to their majority? Yeah, there's some factors. I mean, because look, 38% approval rating president, historically that would be a horror show. But we do know that congressional district boundaries right now are drawn to benefit Republicans in most of these states, that Democrats had, and I'm going to use a technical political science term here, Democrats picked in 2010 the wrong year to suck, because it was the last election before redistricting, the 2011 redistricting, and losing the majority of governorships, losing the majority of state legislative chambers, man, it was just so. These are very, very, and there are exceptions. Illinois is an exception, California's an exception, but this is a very, very generous set of maps for Republicans. And second, we know population patterns. Keeping in mind that once you win a congressional district by one vote, every vote on top of that is wasted. So where do Democratic voters live? Urban areas and college towns. Where do Republican voters live? Everywhere else. That Republican voters are more efficiently allocated across the districts, while Democrats are highly concentrated. In other words, Democrats just waste a whole lot of votes. So between the maps and population patterns, these are factors that could mitigate what looks like a horrific political environment. Now, how much? We have no way of knowing. This is just pure guesstimate. Every wave I've ever seen started looking kind of like this, okay? Now, does it mean it's going to last a year? No, we don't know that. But when you look at CNN, ABC Washington Post, Fox, and NBC Wall Street Journal, the percentage of people, this is not approve, disapprove, this is strongly disapprove. All the four of those polls, the strong disapprove was 48, 49, or 50. Now, anybody that ever strongly disapproves ain't ever going to get to approve. I mean, the people that dance around are the somewhat approve, somewhat disapprove, and people with no opinion. Of course, they don't vote anyway, so they don't really matter. But anyway, but things could change. The kind of wave that this looks and feels like is the kind of wave that historically would cause the president's party to lose maybe 30 seats, all the way up to, I remember there's a 65-seat loss in midterm elections. So big, 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 big. I think the maps and population patterns mitigate that to a certain extent, so that now the wave that might be 30 to 65 seats may just be a 20 to 30 seat wave. And if it's 20 to 30, is it 23 or less, or is it 24 or more? And if you were going to be generous to Republicans going into yesterday, you might say, well, give them, maybe put a little finger on the scale for Republicans hanging on by single digits. Immediately after yesterday, I'd be inclined to put a finger on the scale, a little finger on the scale the other way, but essentially it's 50. I think the House is 50-50. I think you will likely see a single-digit margin, seat margin in the House of Representatives. Now, I have a friend who spent a lot of time on Wall Street, and he likes to ask me, Charlie, if you're wrong, where are you wrong? Why are you wrong? If it's not single digits, it means the Democrats picked up double digits. If I'm, the upside risk or the downside risk for Republicans is a heck of a lot higher than single digits one way, than the upside potential. So that's the House of Representatives, and but watch retirements in competitive districts, because you take away the advantage of incumbency, and these elections, these races float a good bit more and are more susceptible to national trends. The Senate, real quickly, the pattern for the Senate is it's not quite as strong as in the House, but it's pretty strong. You have to start using, since the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, which went into effect in 1913, calling for the direct election of senators rather than state legislatures picking them, the party in the White House has lost Senate seats in 19 out of 26, so that's 73%. Still a pretty strong pattern. When you're looking at the Senate, and as I get older, I tend to sort of go from grassroots to treetops to 10,000. I tend to kind of go a little higher, bigger view, and look at history a little more. That I don't think it ever really dawned on me before that for the Senate, it's really, really useful to look at what happened and why 6 years ago, what happened and why 12 years ago. So go back 12 years, 2006. The war in Iraq is hugely unpopular by that point. President George W. Bush's job approval rating in the Gallup poll going into Election Day was 38%, note. And Republicans lost, 6 Senate seats, and I believe it was 21 House seats, something like that. It was horrific. I lost my train of thought. Anyway, horrible. So Republicans lose 6 Senate seats in that election. 6 years later, the last time this specific class of Senate seats were up, it was 2012. President Obama was winning re-election over Mitt Romney by 3 points, a little wider than expected, and that amazing Obama organization was cranking Democratic voters out in a whole lot of states and really was pulling out a lot of Democrats even in states that weren't competitive and where they're really, you know, they didn't really need an organization, but Democrats came out of the woodwork. And Republicans picked up, or Democrats picked up another 2 Senate seats in that class on top of the 6 they already had. So that's why you have the 25 Democratic seats up this time and only 9 Republican seats. But to me, just the numerical exposure for Republicans, that's sort of, that's minor compared to where they are. And you all know the statistics. 10 Democratic Senate incumbents are up in states that Donald Trump carried. 5 of them are in states that Donald Trump carried by 19 points or more. And you look at that and go, holy mackerel. And then now, think of this. I was on a program in September, and I was the last morning speaker, and Newt Gingrich was the lunch speaker. And so I hung out to listen to him, because Newt is always, I mean, you could agree with him or disagree, you could like him or dislike, but he's always an interesting guy to listen to. But you know, he made the point 2 years ago, if any of us were, you know, looking forward to the 2016 election, what would your sort of base case assumption would be? That Hillary Clinton would probably win the presidency, and there would be a decent chance that Democrats would certainly have a majority in the Senate. You know, the House, you know, maybe not. But anyway, but anyway, that and what sort of regulatory you know, all that. Now, where are we right now? Virtually 180 degrees differently. So right now, if Hillary Clinton had won the presidency with Republicans having a 52-48 majority, but with 10, you know, with this particular group of Senate seats up, what we would be talking about would be, could Republicans pick up, will they pick up just 3 or 4 Senate seats? Or might it be 5 or 6? Might it be 7 or, that Republicans would be knocking on the door of a supermajority of 60 seats. That's where we would almost certainly be based on history. And instead, sort of not so much. And so you look at, you know, right now, if I had to bottom line it, I would say, I'd say I think the Senate's going to be more or less a wash. No net change. Republicans pick up a seat or 2. Democrats pick up a seat or 2, but not a whole lot of change. And for Republicans, that's actually, well, I mean, actually, for Republicans, that is an opportunity lost, because they would have wanted to be, preferred to be, thought they might be, had a week ago yesterday gone the way, you know, pretty much all of us expected, be knocking on the door of 60 seats. So opportunity lost. Now, if you're Chris Van Hollen, the chairman of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, and you're looking at 5 of your members in Trump plus 19 states and 5 more in Trump plus single-digit states, he'd take, I tell you what, you give Chris Van Hollen the option, break even or take your chances with the election. At least before yesterday, and maybe still today, he'd take the wash and run like a thief, because the downside risk for Republicans, I mean for Democrats, is really huge. Now, do I think, let's say, let's blow out yesterday or project forward yesterday a little bit. Can Democrats still win? Can Democrats win a majority in the Senate? 4 minutes. Can Democrats win a majority in the Senate? This is what they would have to do. First, they would have to go 25-0, holding on to all of their own seats. Now, if Republicans are holding on to Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota, where Romney won by 20 and Trump by 36, Joe Manchin in West Virginia, where Romney won by 27, Trump by 42, Joe Donnelly in Indiana, where Romney won by 10, Trump by 19, Claire McCaskill in Missouri, where Romney won by 9, Trump by 19, or John Tester in Montana, where Romney won by 14, Trump by 21. If they hang on to all 5 of those, holy mackerel. I mean, that's why I say Chris Van Hollen would run like a thief with breaking even. And then you got, you know, the Sherrod Browns, Bill Nelsons, Debbie Stabenow, Tammy Baldwin, Bob Casey, and any of those could end up having competitive races except Bill Nelson. It looks very, 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 that's 3 varies likely that Rick Scott, the governor, is going to run against Nelson. Now, Rick Scott does not have all the money in the world, but he has more money than all the rest of us put together multiplied by 10, or maybe 50. But anyway, so it's sort of watching the Big Five plus Florida. And I was on a conference call the other day with the broadcasters, the PAC, and I said, you know, for any of you that own a TV station in Florida, if you lose money next year, you ought to be taken out and shot. I mean, there's just no excuse for it whatsoever. Anyway, ought to be a decent year for radio. But anyway, which they haven't had in a long time. But let's say best case scenario for Democrats. They go 25-0 holding on to their own seats. Then let's say they beat Dean Heller in Nevada, or if Republicans do something really crazy and nominate like Danny Tarkanian, who's 0 for 3 running statewide, do something wild and crazy like that. If they pick that one up, okay, they would have to pick that one up. That's the second one, the second criteria. The third would be picking up Arizona. Now, this is where the Jeff Flake retirement, in a perverse way, actually helps Republicans. Because when he wrote that book, I think unwittingly, he wrote a 160-page suicide note in terms of political suicide note. And where he got to the point where the guy could not, it was becoming increasingly apparent he could not win a Republican primary. But even if he somehow won a Republican primary, the Trump people would probably be so ticked off that a lot of them would stay home and not be there in the general election, so he very likely would have lost the general election. Now, could Republicans end up with Kelly Ward, the one that was, you know, looking like should probably beat Jeff Flake? Look, if Republicans nominate Kelly Ward, the seat is almost certainly going Democratic. But at least this gives Republicans a fair chance of nominating someone that would have a fair chance of winning a general election. So, but my scenario would be Democrats go 25-0, they beat Dean Heller or whoever emerges, they win Arizona, but they're still 1 seat short. And so you say, well, let's do it chronologically. Let's say they've got to win in Alabama. They'd have to beat Roy Moore in Alabama. Now, if Democrats could design a candidate, a Senate nominee in Alabama, it'd be more or less Doug Jones, their nominee. You know, I mean, he at least on paper, I've never met the guy. On paper, he's terrific. Roy Moore is like, take the worst case scenario for a Republican nominee for the Senate and push it out by 10 times more. But having said that, for a Democrat to win in a state that last year Trump carried by 28 points, Romney by 22 points, it could happen. Now, insert at this point, I used to say I could be thin. Well, I'm still not thin, but so yeah, I don't use that analogy anymore. But anyway, but the thing is, I still don't think it's going to happen, but it's possible. To me, the more likely scenario is if Phil Bredesen, the former 2-term governor of Tennessee, former mayor of Nashville, if he runs, I think that Senate seat would be 50-50, would be a toss-up. If he doesn't run, forget about it. I mean, Democrats will have somebody and they'll get 40% and you know, it's still all over. So if they don't beat Roy Moore, and if Bredesen doesn't run, or if Bredesen does run and loses, and I think it's a little bit more likely that Bredesen does run than not, the last thing I heard. But anyway, or Bredesen loses this scenario. To go the next step, like beat Ted Cruz in Texas, not happening. Just not happening. And Texas is trending towards purple, but it's still got another 4 or 8 years before it's going to get purple. So I think the odds are still very, very, very high that Republicans will hang on to a majority. It could be thinner, but the Senate flipping over. And then finally, because I'm out of time before we go to Q&A, but there are a bunch of really good governor's races out there, and that's something, in state legislative races, and that's huge because the governors that won yesterday, the governors that win a year from now are going to be 48 out of 50 states have 4-year governorships. These are going to be the ones that are in place for so even if you don't even care what happens in state capitals, which is a mistake given the devolution and power moving out to the states because Washington's paralyzed. But the thing is, even if you don't care, if you just cared about redistricting, that alone would be why you should watch these governor's races and state legislative races nationwide. And over the next couple of days, we will know more about what happened overall state legislatively, and outside of, Virginia, New Jersey, but also in some specials elsewhere. We'll know a bit more. There were going to be 40-something after yesterday, or 44 special elections for the duration of the year, so it could still dance around a little bit. So let me stop, but the bottom line is elections have consequences. That last one, it really did, but anyway, let's open it up for questions, comments, accusations, and there are microphones on each side of the room. So wave your hands in a non-threatening fashion. My gosh, a shy group of National Journal members.
Well, I keep getting up here first somehow.
Oh, there you are. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm here. And I'm first again. So,
I thought you were walking that, and I thought you were leaving.
No, I wasn't leaving.
And I thought, well, I wonder which part ticked her off,
No, nothing ticked me off, and I've got lots of questions, but I'm going to focus on a House of Representatives question. So you talked about redistricting and how right now that favors Republicans, and we know about that. So I'm a mathematician, let me just say that, which I've said before.
And I'm not.
Yeah, and we the method that we've used for almost 100 years to reapportion also favors Republicans right now. Well, it favors small states. And that's something in the mathematical world we talk a lot about. Does that resonate at all in the political world? Okay.
No. No, I mean, the thing is, it should, but for people, for in applied politics, we might as well be talking about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, because, it just did. Yeah. Now, if I could wave a magic wand and do one single political reform in this country, it wouldn't be campaign finance reform, because frankly, I think that's overrated. And until the Supreme Court changes its interpretation of spending as a form of speech, it ain't going to change. I would do redistricting reform. I think the gold standard is Iowa, where there's basically a group of people like you go into a windowless room and draw the lines more or less the way God would draw the lines, ignoring where incumbents live and all the things like that. Now, is Iowa a little easier given the fact that it's lily white and has square counties? Yeah, it's a little easy. Yeah, okay. But the process is a good one. The California one is kind of this Rube Goldberg thing that ends up okay, not great. In Arizona, I've never really understood the Arizona Commission thing. But Iowa would be the gold standard. That would do more. I mean, there's no silver bullet to fix the problems facing and the excessive partisanship and what's going on in this country, but that's the one bullet that would be the most meaningful out there, would be that one. But yeah, I mean, the Founding Fathers, it was amazing how many things they anticipated. And I know that they wanted to keep small states from getting trampled by big states. We know that. Had they anticipated this, maybe they would have done something somewhat differently. But That's not going to happen. So I don't, but that's why that's why academia is so wonderful, because they could worry about big things, cosmic things, and trivialities like, is there any chance or not? Not so much. But I'm with you. That would change. That would redistricting form most important thing we could do right now. Yeah.
I guess knowing what I know now about the state legislature in Virginia, that might take something out of this premise for the question. But with the governor's races, the individuals, to me, it was very interesting. You could almost switch the party labels in the past. Someone tells me an Army veteran who's a pediatrician's running. Someone says a longtime political consultant, Politico, is running. You flip the R&D there, and I would have believed it. But this time that happened. So I guess the question is, how much does that individual matter? How much is this an anti-Trump wave with the state legislature? I get that, but still the individual matters in the individual state, and not so much of that anti-Trump.
Yeah, individuals matter, but I think the trend, we are seeing more and more voters behaving as if it's a parliamentary system. And remember the stat that I used towards the front. 4 out of the last 6 elections, either the House, the Senate, or in 2 of them, both switched sides. You didn't used to see that. You really, really didn't. And it's not that huge numbers of people are getting up, moving to the other side of the room, but just enough are that are fickle enough that it's making a difference. So, but individuals matter. In terms of this election, I think the key thing is it was really, I mean, look at as boring a guy as Ralph Northam is, and looking at the ads, you'd have thought he had been the Bernie Sanders campaign chairman. And president of the Virginia ACLU. I mean, you would have thought that. And so they had, and having, but the thing is, to me, I guess maybe this is tortured, but I was at a breakfast this morning at a embassy, and there were a handful of journalists, and there was one Republican strategist there, and I turned to the Republican and said, what advice would you give your clients based on what we saw yesterday? And really, really, really smart guy, and fundamentally had nothing to say. And because the thing, but now, this is not what he said, but if I'm a Republican, I'm trying to figure out, how do I handle this situation? I'm a conventional Republican, okay? Now, conventional Republican looks over and says, and again, this is a Republican primary, but looks at Luther Strange, who I've known for 30 years and like a lot, who basically got in bed with President Trump, and it did him no good whatsoever. None, zero. So plan A didn't work. Ed Gillespie embraced Trumpism, but stayed away from Trump himself and didn't use the T word much at all. So, which would be another plausible theory. I don't know what Plan C is for a Republican. I mean, there'll be one, but for a Republican in a competitive state or district, wow. They're scratching their heads right now and hiring more or better pollsters to try to figure out how do they handle this Rubik's Cube that they've got here, because it's a tough situation, and if you miss your calibration, you alienate the Trump base. But if you don't do, and so how do you do? I would love to have been a fly on the wall. What was it? About a month ago Monday, when Mitch McConnell went up to and had lunch with President Trump. I would love to have been a fly on the wall, because Mitch McConnell is always so shy and retiring that I'm going to make up a conversation. Mr. President, I know you don't like me. I know you don't like most of my Republican Senate colleagues. I know you're really disappointed with Republicans on Capitol Hill that we haven't been able to do what you wanted and at the timetable you want. I get all that. And I know that if any of us individually lost re-election, that you would not shed a tear, any of them. But Mr. President, think about this. Republicans in Congress, the Republicans in the House are what's standing between you and impeachment. The Republicans in the Senate are what's between you and an impeachment conviction. Every time you criticize me, us, collectively, individually, Kill and Flake and weakening Dean Heller and, every time you criticize us, what you're doing is making it more difficult for Republicans to get the Trump base. You're driving a wedge between the Trump base and the rest of the Republican Party and the Republican Congress. You're driving a wedge there, and you're going to make it that much harder to get the Trump people out in 2018. And the analogy that I use, it's not a perfect one, but it's okay. 2008, we have this, Obama's running, and we have this huge new age, new America turnout with lots and lots of young people and idealistic voters, and minority turnout and Hispanic turnout goes up and all this, and Democrats pick up 6 Senate seats and 21 House seats or whatever. I mean, a bunch of House seats. 2010, Obama's name's not on the ballot, and Democrats have a devastating election and lose the House. 2012, President Obama's name is on the ballot, and Democrats have a pretty good election. And 2014, it's not. That's right. And Fred Yang, a Democratic pollster, said to me, they don't call them Obama voters for nothing. Well, the thing is, take out the word Obama and insert the word Trump. Are they Trump voters or are they Republican voters? And so that's why I think McConnell, I suspect that was sort of the gist of what Senator McConnell had to say to the president. Because I think the president, you don't make as much money as President Trump has made without being a pretty smart guy. But I don't think he's a chess player. I don't think he thinks 2 or 3 political moves down the board. And I don't think it had really dawned on him the implication of those worthless Republicans on Capitol Hill in his mind losing and what that meant for him personally and things like subpoenas and convictions and things. So, anyway. Yes, sir.
Hey, Charlie. Just wanted to ask you, you make a point in the materials that were handed out to us that in your conclusion that Democrats are for the justice-oriented party and Republicans are the freedom-oriented party, and that's the cleavage that you see. But I had a sense in the Virginia elections that I watched more closely than New Jersey, that the reason that so many voters stood out in the rain, a really bad rainy day, to vote, and voted in the numbers they did in places like Loudoun County and didn't vote in the numbers like they did in the rural areas, that anger is the biggest factor in elections right now, and that it's an emotional factor, not a policy factor, that it's a hatred for the inability of the government to function. And so the point you're making about what the Republicans might do to be able to pull off some kind of a rationale for staying Republican, in the face of Trump blaming them for, as you just described, failing to perform, it strikes me that there's more volatility in these midterms that we're seeing than might be historically typical. And I wanted to ask you about anger and what you think about that, and whether it could just flip the pollsters again, like happened in the general election. And I wanted to ask you whether what you would advise the Democrats to, how you advise the Democrats to characterize what's happening in a way that doesn't cause the Trump voter to decide to actually go to the polls in the midterms rather than stay home?
Okay. The first part was not really related to any kind of electoral behavior, but it's just sort of what is the fundamental difference between Democrats and Republicans, with Republicans putting a great value on freedom, on liberty, on letting markets work their ways, and Democrats put a premium on fairness, justice, equality, social safety net, stuff like that. So that's just sort of different value structures between the two sides. And I should give credit, the originator of that thought is a Virginia State Senator, Dave Marsden, really, really smart guy. And just over lunch, he threw that out to me, and I've appropriated it, but with credit usually. But that's more esoteric 60, 70,000 feet stuff. In terms of who votes in midterm elections, there are two ways of looking at it. There's demographic and attitudinal. Demographic, the kinds of people who are more, presidential elections, the electorate is big, it's broad, it's diverse, it looks more or less like the country. Midterm elections, when about 40% fewer people vote, tend to be older, whiter, more conservative, more Republican. So you look at the demographics and you say, well, that's good for Republicans. But then if you say attitudinally, it's people who are angry, people who have an axe to grind. That anybody that's happy with what's going on or complacent or disappointed in their side, they just don't have the motivational. So is it more demographic? Is it more attitudinal? But angry people, anger dominates. I tell you, if you had to choose between what is the strongest emotion in politics, love or hate? Oh, hell, that's not even close. It's hate unless despise is an option, And so that's, and when you have the presidency, the House and the Senate, there's only one direction for the finger to point. So Republicans have to be really, really, really worried. And in some ways, you could argue, this is a point for you, an argument you could be made that this is the worst of all worlds. That Democratic-leaning voters hate everything Republicans want and are trying to do. And the Republican voters are disappointed because you're not able to do anything like what you said you wanted to do. So it's kind of the worst of both worlds. Now, it's more complicated than that. But so anger, hate, this is, and look at, 2010, the 4 out of 6 chambers turning over, and you look at Democrats in 1994 with Clinton's first term, midterm. You just sort of look at these, and boy, it's ugly. So, no, your point's well taken, but I wouldn't push the liberty justice thing I wouldn't want to apply it to any election state. It's just sort of who thinks of themselves as Democrats, who thinks of themselves as Republicans, more like that.
So hi, Bill Womack with Deloitte. Good to see you again. So I have a question and I have a favor to ask. The question is, and
I'm always up for a lobster bisque at the Capitol Grill again.
All right. Well, so at that lunch, I bet David $20 what would happen last night, and I lost. So I need to give that to you to give to him.
I tell you what, David Wasserman has double the IQ points that I have, but one thing that I will advise, I should advise David. I stopped betting on politics about 25 years ago.
Well, he won.
Because anytime someone beats me on a political bet, 300 people will eventually hear about it. If I win the bet, nobody's going to hear about it. So it's just good policy, but I will pass it along. Go ahead.
All right, well, I hope I didn't just get David in trouble. So, anywho, look, as we take a look at the dynamic that's playing out, and you discussed it some with like Roy Moore down in Alabama, and there are other examples as you see the populist wings of the party in the ascendant. How, in recognizing and appreciate your point that you're more of a political than a policy guy, but if you look at it from the interests of the business community, there are specific elements like immigration reform that I think that we can all do the calculus on. But in a general sense, do you have any idea how open they're going to be to the needs of the business community? Are they still going to be, if you think about it in very simplistic terms, is the Republican Party going to remain the go-to party for business in a general sense?
I can come up with all kinds of reasons why the business community is disappointed with the direction that President Trump and Republicans in Congress have done to a large extent, and trade, and most of the business community had come around on Paris, on the Paris Climate Accord, and visas and all the, absolutely. But every time, and I know that demographically, highly educated, upscale people are trending more towards Democrats, and downscale whites are trending more towards Republicans. I get that. But every time I try to take the next leap and say that Democrats may be evolving into a Democratic Leadership Council, pro-business, sympathetic to business party, I think 4 words: Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders. And to me, if you ask me the question, where is the center of gravity in the Democratic Party right now? Is it closer to Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton, or is it closer to Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders? Oh, I think it's closer to Bernie and Elizabeth. And I personally think that's a terrible place for them to go, but they didn't ask me. But anyway, so I think that business may find themselves, okay, I'll give an optimistic and a pessimistic way of putting it. Optimistic, they're free agents. Pessimistic, they're homeless. But they're just gonna reward good behavior, punish bad behavior. But you think about, I had a question the other day. Somebody asked me about millennial voters and the Republican Party, and I said, the thing about it is, I don't think that millennial voters are particularly excited about the idea of this big monolithic Soviet-style government and big government running things. I think that's actually very contrary to where most millennials are thinking. But then you look at cultural issues, and Republicans are just way on the wrong side of that. So that my advice to Republicans would be not mimic Democrats on social issues. My advice to them is shut the hell up. Just don't talk about this stuff. And would some of the people in their base get their noses out of joint? Yeah. But you know what? If they have a choice between voting for a Republican that's somewhat supportive of them but doesn't talk about what really resonates with me, or an Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders clone, that'll get Republican turnout out just out of fear, if nothing else. So I just think I do think the business community, you're going to have to do this on a member by member basis of trying to kind of win them over and to help the Republicans that are conventional establishment business oriented, when they get into a primary jam, man, I'd back them to the hilt. And if a Republican is in a general election who's against so many of the values that or good things that are important to my business, then I would either A, oppose them, or B, I'd sit on my checkbook. and just not give them. But the thing is, I think they've got, I think the business community needs to reward good behavior and punish bad behavior. And the punishing bad behavior they haven't done much of. I mean, I don't know that there have been a whole lot of consequences on trade visa, in terms of support. So I think you're free agents. Let's just stay with the positive side. Is that making sense? I'm in OT, I think, but I'll do it, say, as long as y'all want. But thank you very much. Kevin, you're coming up here, right? Yeah, we'll start walking this way. And but thank you very much for your membership.
Please welcome back Kevin Turpin, President of National Journal.
Your membership enables people like us to study this stuff and to look at it and to convey whether it's right or wrong or whatever, what we're doing, what we're thinking. But thank you very much for your support.
Charlie, your bonus check is direct deposited for that. Well, thank you all, as Charlie said, for joining us, especially for those of you who stayed for all 4 hours. I hope this was a valuable event. One thing I'll mention is we'll be sending a feedback form via email. Love to get your insights on things that we did well today, things that we didn't do well. We're always aspiring to provide better service. So a good day, good afternoon to everyone, and look forward to seeing you again. Bye-bye.